Please be seated. The record will show the presence of the jury, the defendant, and all counsel. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Did any of you hear or see anything about this case in the media, meaning television, radio, newspapers, the internet, any other form of media? I see no hands. Did anyone attempt to speak to you about this case other than those involved in the trial, including my staff? I see no hands. Mr. Martinez, you may continue with follow-up.
Sir, when we last left, we were talking about the PDS and the scoring. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And one of the things that we discussed was Exhibit 535, which is this exhibit here. And this one has the scores 15 and 33. When was this created?
This was created at the time, there were two times that I actually calculated this. Once was when I did the original scoring, so that would have been around the time that I did my evaluation. And the other time was a second time when I didn't have access to my original calculations, and for my own purposes, I wanted to recalculate it. And I did, and there was an arithmetic error apparently, and the number is different. But I do want to point something out.
No, sir, my question to you is, when did you create exhibit number 535? As best as you know, when?
As best as I know, either at the time that I did my evaluation, which if you need a specific date, I'll give you a date.
Here, let me give you an exhibit so that'll help you out. How about exhibit number 534? It says January 15th of 2010, right?
That's correct.
So you either did it on or around January 15th of 2010, or when?
Correct. And then I did it a second time.
Okay.
And that may have been up to 6 months later, I'm not sure. I didn't have access to the original calculations. For my own purposes, I was reviewing my data, and I recalculated it, and that would account for the discrepancy in the number.
So exhibit 550, the one with the dots in it, was this before exhibit number 535? Which came first?
The dots.
So if we're looking at it, then this one right here, exhibit number 550 came first, and then we have the scores that are set out there, correct?
That's correct.
And then for some reason, you decided to rescore it sometime later, right?
That's correct.
And you decided to rescore it, and as a result of that, you came up with 535, right?
That's correct.
This rescoring, you were trying to say something about this rescoring and that you didn't have something in front of you. When you rescored it, didn't you have exhibit number 534 in front of you?
I had the raw data in front of me, yes.
Which is 534, right?
Right.
And isn't that really all that you need to score this test?
Yes.
And so you then said that when you rescored it, which is exhibit number 535, that something was missing. What is it that you said was missing?
My original worksheet. I didn't have access to it.
You didn't have, when you say original worksheet, you're saying 534?
No, the original, well, it says it's identified as the worksheet. I don't know the number of the document, but it's, I think what you're holding in your hand, actually.
But isn't this what she provided to you, 534?
Yes, that is the raw data.
Right, and isn't this what you take and then input into, for example, exhibit 550, and we'll just use an example of part 1, question number 1. She said yes, so there's a circle there for the yes, right?
Yes.
So what is it that you didn't have that you needed for exhibit 535?
That is what you're holding in your hand.
Right.
The earlier version is what I did not have.
You didn't have...
I didn't have it in my hand at the time that I was re-scoring that particular test.
You didn't have exhibit 550 in your hand?
Well, I don't know what 550 is, sir. Could you bring it to me? And
Sure.
That, I had 550 in my hand. But there are two forms connected to this.
Let me have it back. have 550 in your hand along with 534 at the time that you rescored this? As
I had
reflected, hold on, as reflected in 535.
I had part of one of those exhibits in my hands.
Well, you definitely had 534, right?
I'm not sure I had that one with me either. I know that I had the summary score sheet that has the circles filled in. That I had with me. I don't know that I carried that with me at that time.
Sir, why is it that you're going about and rescoring something, which is number 535, without the raw data? Isn't that how it gets transferred over to the score sheets? By
Well, it
using the raw
could.
data, yes or no?
They can't answer that yes or no, sir.
So this isn't used to transfer it over to, as we have in Exhibit 535, 550, I'm sorry, the dots. That's not what's used. See that?
Yes, but that's part of the exhibit that you gave me, and I didn't have the second part of that exhibit, but I had the first part of the exhibit.
Judge, what exhibit is being shown to the jury?
Exhibit 550. Sir, if you have Exhibit 534, isn't it just a mechanical issue to take what's in 534 and take this score sheet and fill out the little round circles? Isn't that?
Yes, and I had the sheet with the little round circles.
All right, if you had the sheet with the little round circles in it, isn't that all that you needed for filling out 535?
Yes.
So what is it that was missing then? You keep telling me that something was missing. What was missing?
Sir, I'm trying to explain to you, it's pretty simple to me, and maybe I'm not explaining it properly
Maybe
for
you're
you.
not. Why don't you tell me what was missing? Give me something succinct.
The original worksheet, which you have also held up, but I don't know what number it is.
534.
No, that's not it.
This is not the original worksheet?
That's not a worksheet, that's the answer sheet. The worksheet is connected to the answer sheet that has the dots on it. You have two exhibits there connected to one staple. And therefore, I can't talk about one and not the other.
All right, well, let's take a look at Exhibit 550 so that we'll know what you're talking about. We have the front page, right?
Yes?
We have the second page, which is the one with the dots on it, right?
Correct.
The third page also has some dots on it, right?
That's correct.
And we've agreed that from Exhibit 534, you can just transfer the information to the dots, right?
That's correct.
Then there is an ABC portion of it. Do you see that?
Yes.
And if we take a look at exhibit number 535, that's the same thing, ABC, right?
Yes.
And then if we go to the next and last page, it says DEF, right?
Yes.
And so we have DEF here, right?
Yes.
There's nothing else left in exhibit 550. What worksheet are you talking about?
I'm talking about the worksheet that, sir, I'm trying to explain to you. You have two separate documents stapled
Absolutely.
together with the same number. And so I'm trying to talk about one part of that particular piece of evidence.
So are you saying at that time that you did or scored number 535, did you have the front page of 550? Yes, sir. Did you have the second page?
That is the dots? Yes.
Did you have the third page? More dots.
Yes.
Did you have the fourth page?
No.
So what you didn't have was your previous scoring, right?
Correct.
So what you're saying then is that you were able to go through your files and you were able to find this first, if you will, 1, 2, 3 pages, right?
Sure, yes.
And because you couldn't find the other 2 pages, you decided to rescore it. Is that what you're saying?
I didn't take this original scoring with me. I was out of town. I had taken some additional material with me to work on in my spare time when I was out of town. I did not take the original scoring. I left it back in my office. But I did have a blank sheet, so I recalculated in a hasty fashion in order to determine whether or not my original scoring was correct.
So what you're saying is you didn't have what you originally scored, which is the last 2 pages of Exhibit 550, right?
That is correct.
And you decided on a whim or for whatever reason that you wanted to rescore it, which is what we're talking
It was
about.
not on a whim, sir.
Well, you decided to rescore it even though you already had a result in 550,
For my
right?
own purposes, yes, and I'm entitled to do that, by the way.
No one's asking you whether or not you're entitled to do it or not. Why is it that this then was separate from the this exhibit here, which is 535?
Because somehow when you picked up my pile of papers on the desk here and took it and placed it into evidence, you also picked up a piece of information that I hadn't disclosed.
So what you're saying is it's the prosecutor's fault that exhibit 550 came to light?
I'm not saying it was your fault. I'm saying that it was picked up as part of a pile of information I had here and entered into evidence.
But if you are somewhere else and you have the file with you, what is the necessity of scoring? And well, when did you rescore this? Give me a date.
Probably 3 or 4 months after.
What is the necessity of rescoring this since you already have an original score? Did you doubt yourself?
No, sir. I decided I wanted to recalculate it. That's all. I have the option to do that should I want to do it. I could score it 10 times if I wanted to.
But you decided that you didn't, for whatever reason, when you were out of town, you decided to do it, right?
Yes.
Where were you?
Palm Springs.
So why is it that you're taking this individual's file or part of the file, and knowing that you don't have the other score with you, you decide to rescore it? Wouldn't it have been helpful to have the previous one so that you could at least compare?
Sir, I was away on a weekend vacation. I always take my work with me in the event I have some downtime and I want to work on it. I take my computer. I take selected portions of the file so I'm not carrying around a tremendous amount of material. I had some downtime. I had the raw data. I had a blank form, but I did not have the copy of the form that I had filled out before. Just so that I knew where I was going with this, I decided to rescore it. It was not meant to be disclosed. And in fact, the numbers have no relevance whatsoever to my diagnosis and the support of this test of PTSD.
Am I asking you anything about whether or not these numbers are relevant to your finding that or diagnosis of PTSD? I'm not asking you that, am I?
No, you're not.
So you decided to rescore it, and on one, the later one, it's the number of the symptoms, you get 15, right?
Yes.
And on the earlier one, the number of symptoms is 17, right?
Yes.
You got it wrong both times, didn't you?
Yep.
And in fact, had you rescored it again, you would have found that you would have gotten a third number, right?
That's correct, which I have here.
Am I asking you if you have it there?
No, you're not asking me.
So, as it turns out, when you do the first one, which is exhibit number 550, so that we're clear, you got a score of 17, right?
Sir, the numbers have nothing to do with what I reported.
Am I asking you if the numbers are important?
Judge, may he finish what the answer to the question, please?
Yes,
May I answer?
for a question.
Okay, sorry.
Sir, I'm not asking you if the numbers are important. I'm just asking you if the numbers match here.
No, they do not match.
And so on exhibit 150, you have a 17. And at that time, when you calculated that, you had everything you needed in front of you, right?
Yes.
You had the raw data, which is in exhibit number 534, and you sat down and you started to do this hand scoring, right?
Yes.
You were not pressured by time, right?
No.
So then when you went on vacation, you decided to rescore it again, and then that's 535. And at that time, you said, well, I didn't have all of the data, and so I came up with a score of 15, right?
I had all the data.
Mischaracterizes his testimony whether or not he had all of the data. He was missing the previous score sheet, not the data.
I'm going to object the speaking objection issue.
Yes, no speaking objections. If you need to make an extended objection, please ask to approach. Overruled, you may continue.
So what we're talking about here in exhibit number 535, this is the one that you did when you were on vacation, right?
Yep.
And this is the one that you're saying that you didn't have all the data, right?
No, I had all the data. I did not have the scored sheet, the original hand-scored sheet. And I wanted to recalculate it to make certain that the DSM diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder was met, and it was.
And even though it was, it looks like what we have here is a situation where you have, if you will, you've done this scoring 3 times, right?
Correct.
And the necessity for the scoring of these things 3 times is that you're a little bit sloppy, right?
Objection, Your Honor, argumentative.
Overruled.
Right?
I made an arithmetic error, which does not affect the
And
utility of the
That's just not
test.
He's going beyond my question.
Overruled, you may finish.
Thank you. The diagnostic criteria is met on the first go-around of scoring. I tested that component, and each time that I scored it, Ms. Arias met or even exceeded the minimum requirement for a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. The further calculations were dealing with symptom severity, total number of symptoms, and so on. However, I did not report those numbers in my report as they were irrelevant to my purposes. All I said in my report was that the scoring of the post-traumatic stress disorder scale supported the original diagnosis which I made based upon my clinical and forensic experience and all the interviews that I conducted. It confirmed the presence of PTSD. All that I was referring to was the first level of scoring, which if you would take a close look at these score sheets, was identical in all three versions. I did not refer to the numbers in my report, and they were not relevant to anything, any conclusion that I made.
And so in those 35 years of experience, sir, this is what we get from you. That we get on one score, you get 15, on another, you get 17, and then you come here today and finally tell us it's at 16. That's what we get, right?
Yes, but as I said, those numbers were not relevant to my analysis.
Did I ask you if they were relevant?
No, you did not.
The other thing, sir, that we have here is that you said that you did the MCMI-3. Do you remember that?
Yes,
541. And this is a printout of that, right?
yes,
And this is a printout after a computer actually scored it, right?
correct.
Sir, did you also rescore this one too?
No.
Let me show you something then.
Overruled.
Take a look at exhibit number 553. See if you recognize it.
Well, this is not my printout. This is someone else's printout.
Why do you say that's somebody else's printout?
Because it has a date up on top, which mine does not print out.
Well, sir, are you sure, are you positive that that wasn't attached to a report that was disclosed to the state?
I'm quite certain.
You
I can
are-
tell you, well, I can tell you in a minute.
May we have that, please?
I don't believe this is mine.
regard to Exhibit 553, have you had a chance to take a look at your report and see whether or not this is part of it?
Yes, apparently they've changed the protocol. That is mine. That is from my report.
Well, when you say they changed the protocol, you're in charge of the ship, aren't you?
No, this is a commercial scoring service that I use, and occasionally they change the format. Currently, they're not putting the dates on, so.
You did say, for example, that this was scored in December of 2009, right? In an answer to a question from the jury. Do you remember that?
Yes, it was scored at that time, but this is the date of the administration.
And so one of them has a date on it and one of them does not, right?
Of the two printouts, the two graphs? Yes, that's correct.
And the reason for that is that it was run twice, right?
No.
Why is it that then this sheet, after it's completed and disclosed and presented to us, exhibit number 541, and I'm just looking at the top, but all I care about is a date. How come that somehow a date magically appears on it?
Honestly, I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know.
It's not your mistake, it's somebody else's mistake, right?
It couldn't be my mistake because that comes off the internet. That's a printout. And I can't account for the fact that one had a date and one didn't have a date.
Sir, you talked in answer to jurors' questions about your diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, right?
Yes.
And in fact, this morning you addressed it again. You indicated to me that with regard to this PTS, even though there were whatever numbers are there, it doesn't change your diagnosis of PTS, right?
Correct.
PTSD, correct?
Yes.
Exhibit 544 is in essence your diagnosis. You said that Jodi Arias clearly falls under criteria A1, A2, B3, C3, C6.
Well, there were two or three others that I had omitted on that line.
Sir, I'm just asking you to follow along. I'm reading it. And D3, isn't that what it says?
Yes.
And so, sir, one of the things that we know is that in Exhibit 545 is that there, under each one of these sections, it indicates, for example, that there has to be, for example, D, there has to be two or more of the following, right? In order for the diagnosis to be confirmed, right?
Yes.
And under C, it calls for three or more of the factors listed in there for the diagnosis to be confirmed, right?
Yes.
And you're looking at what appears to be your printout of the DSM-4 diagnostic criteria for PTSD, right?
Yes.
Let me show you this exhibit, which has already been marked. Is this a true and accurate depiction of what you have there and the diagnostic criteria for PTSD?
Yes.
And that's what you based your diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder in this case, and that's what you told the jury that you did in response to their questions, right?
Yes.
I move for the admission of Exhibit 545.
Yes.
I'm going to talk to you about the D section. And, talk about defining a post-traumatic stress disorder, okay?
Yes,
And that's the one that requires 2 or more of 5 factors that are set out there, correct?
yes, and there are 3.
I'm not asking you that, am I? I know you want to jump the gun, but let's slow it down a little bit.
Objection regarding jumping the gun.
Sustained.
You did say that you found D3, right?
I did.
D3 has to do with difficulty concentrating, right?
Yes,
And in fact, one of the things that we need to remember is that these factors, 1 through 5, have to be present after the traumatic event, right?
that's correct.
That's why they call it post-traumatic stress disorder, right?
Yes,
Because if the factors were present before, then they wouldn't be part of the diagnosis. It wouldn't support the diagnosis, right?
which is a post-traumatic stress
Right.
disorder.
So if the factors were present before the traumatic event, then they can't be counted, right?
That's not necessarily true, but they were present at the time of my evaluation, so that's irrelevant.
So you're saying, for example, let's talk about D1. Let's start with D1. One of the things that it indicates there is that this individual, one of the first factors is difficulty falling or staying asleep, right?
Yes,
And I've written it down. There it is. Difficulty falling or staying asleep. She didn't manifest that, did she?
no, she did not.
So that's a no. Number 2, D2, talks about irritability or outbursts of anger, right?
Yes,
And you indicated to us, so that one, that, yeah, she did meet that one, right?
yes,
And you told us that she met that one because of this sort of fighting with her mother, right?
yes,
But isn't it true, sir, that you told us that you reviewed the corroborating data? Do you remember telling us that?
I do.
Isn't it true that in terms of her outbursts of anger with her mother, that had been present since her teenage years?
But not to the degree that it began.
Yes or no?
Could you repeat that?
Judge, may he answer the question? It's not a yes or no.
All right. Witness requested the question be restated or repeated. Mr. Martinez.
With regard to this issue involving the fighting with her mother, that was present, yes or no, from her teenage years, correct?
Yes, to a lesser degree.
Well, let's talk about that lesser degree. Take a look at 3 exhibits and see what that lesser degree is.
Yes.
Sir, take a look at exhibit number 554 and read the highlighted portion.
Okay, Jodi and
Oh,
Seth.
no, to yourself.
Oh, to myself,
All right,
okay.
and then put it down.
Okay,
And this is something that you're familiar with, right?
yes, I am.
All right. Exhibit 555. Take a look at that, and I want you to read the highlighted portion also.
Okay,
And you're familiar with that, right?
yes,
Exhibit number 556, take a look at this first. This is 476 on the right, the number.
yes,
And in fact, that's something that was in the journals, right?
yes,
And you read it in the journals, right?
yes.
And same exhibit, 480 on the right. It's page 480, take a look. What's that? This is page 480, correct?
Yes,
You read that too, and you're familiar with that, right?
yes,
And this is part of what you used when considering or evaluating this outburst that the defendant had on the telephone with her mother, right?
yes.
Judge, she said she wanted to approach.
All right, please approach.
Sir, with regard to some of the information that you have, isn't it true that you had information that when the defendant was a teenager, which is before this happened, June 4th, 2008, right? That was conduct before June 4th of 2008 when she was a teenager, right?
Yes,
Okay, when she was a teenager, isn't it true that the defendant had such anger towards her mother Sandy that she treated her like crap?
yes,
And isn't it true that they argued all the time, right?
yes,
And isn't it true that during that time, the defendant hit Sandy for no reason, right?
yes,
And this was all before this June 4th, 2008 incident, right?
but it's irrelevant to the
Am I
diagnosis.
asking you that? Isn't it before?
Well, it's before, but it's not relevant.
I know you say it's not relevant, but D does say, sir, persistent symptoms of increased arousal not present before the trauma. Doesn't it say that?
Yes,
And as indicated by two or more of the following. On a
Correct.
separate occasion,
Judge, objection. May I approach?
Yes, you may approach.
and sir, with regard to the move from Phoenix to California, that was sometime in April of 2008, right?
yes,
She was no longer a teenager there, was she?
no,
And in that instance, there was a circumstance when, as you read her journal, and you told us you read her journal, the defendant's mother, Sandy, came out here to help her with the move to Eureka, right?
yes,
And during that time, Jodi got very upset and yelled at Sandy, right?
yes,
And isn't it true that the defendant and Sandy never got along, right?
correct,
And Jodi, or the defendant, was always mean to Sandy, and no one knows why, right?
correct.
So, sir, I know what you indicated was to you an important factor here was that there was this telephone call that was made after June 4th of 2008, correct?
Well, from what I understand, there were several.
All right, several telephone calls that were made after June 4th of 2008, right?
Yes.
You never heard a recording of those calls, right?
No, I did not.
Those were related to you by the defendant, right?
Yes,
And this is the person that lied to the police initially, you know that, right? Said she was never at the scene, right?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear your objection.
Relevance.
Overruled.
And this is the same person that filled out the PDS and gave misinformation as to the triggering event, right?
correct.
So if you take a look at that, then all you have are 3 telephone calls, and yet you have other people saying that there were these issues involving the defendant and her mother, right?
We discussed that at great length, and it was made clear to me that the focus of her anger and the intensity of her anger were elevated. But I might point out to you that that's one of 3 criteria that I selected.
Right. I understand there's one of 3 criteria, and we're going to get to the others. But additionally, isn't it true that at some point, one of the times they were together, they were sitting down for dinner or something, and isn't it true that the defendant got mad and kicked Sandy
Objection.
for no reason,
Previous objection.
Overruled.
correct?
I read that, yes.
For no reason, right?
Well, that's what it says, yes.
Yeah, and you are looking at this and you're saying that you're the person that used this as part of your evaluation, right?
Yes, I did.
And so with regard to that, what you're saying is that, well, you're going to believe as part of your evaluation, 3 telephone calls that were made after June 4th, and you're going to disregard an event that happened in April of 2008 and disregard this long-standing bad relationship where the defendant was yelling at her mother in finding irritability and outbursts of anger, right?
Objection, Judge. This characterization is the number 3. There's never been a specific number of calls. That's not what his testimony was.
Overruled. You may answer.
Said 3 calls, right?
When coming up with a criteria
Sir,
by
how many calls? That was the issue there. How many calls?
there were several calls.
How many is several?
I don't know how many several. I
All
didn't
right,
count
then.
the calls, and it wasn't revealed to me. But there was a
Okay.
pattern of anger that became focused and more intense, according to what was told to me by Ms. Arias. I was fully aware of her difficulties in her relationship with her mother previously, but I believe that the elevation of the intensity of her anger by her report qualified for that diagnosis.
And you say that you believe it because you're the one that's making the judgment that whatever these events were before, in your judgment, it's a judgment call, those do not supersede these several telephone calls for a finding of irritability or outbursts of anger, right?
In my clinical judgment,
Yes or no? That's
I
what you
can't
believe.
answer that yes or no, sir.
All right, then we'll move on.
Yes.
Before Mr. Martinez moves on.
Yes. You may answer the question. We finish your answer.
When one applies the techniques of criteria analysis, you take every piece of information that was given to you. In my case, I used 35 years of experience diagnosing hundreds of cases of post-traumatic stress disorder, took into account the fact that certain characteristics may have predated the trauma. However, according to the report of Ms. Arias, her anger towards her mother became more focused and more intense as a result of her incarceration. Now, we don't know for sure whether she was more angry because she was incarcerated or whether this was a reaction to the trauma that she suffered. Nonetheless, the criteria was met, and in my clinical judgment, I made that call, and I stand behind it.
It was your judgment call, right?
My clinical judgment, yes.
Right. Even though you've just admitted now that the irritability issue could be associated with her incarceration, right?
The criteria exist at the time of the evaluation. I believed, based upon my discussions with her, and as a result of my numerous interviews,
Right.
that
Go ahead, I'm listening.
there was an elevation of her anger and irritability towards her mother based upon her self-report.
Right. And in this, again, goes back to her saying it, right? Self-reporting means she's saying it, right?
Yes.
You didn't get anybody else of the population where she was living to corroborate that, right?
Well, I couldn't speak to the prisoners or...
So the third factor that we have under here, D3, talks about difficulty concentrating, right?
Yes.
And you also found that one, right?
Yes.
And what do you base that on?
I based that upon my 25 to 30 hours of interviews with Ms. Arias.
I understand that
who re-
specifically. Give me a specifics.
He's answering the question, Judge.
You may continue.
Are you asking for one statement out of many?
I'm asking for your specifics that show the defendant had difficulty concentrating.
We discussed the area of concentration. It was pointed out to me that she was having difficulty concentrating by her report. When I delved into it deeper, it appeared to be a phenomenon that was occurring with frequency and regularity to make me believe that this was something that occurred post-trauma. We had numerous conversations about this. It was reported, I took my notes, and I drew a conclusion based upon the information that was available to me at the time.
One example, just give me one example of her difficulty concentrating.
I think she once told me that she was having difficulty reading because she
All right.
couldn't focus and concentrate.
So she told you she had difficulty reading. When she testified on cross-examination, do you know that she said that she had read the Book of Mormon from cover to back? Did you know that?
Well, I wasn't,
Hold on, there's an objection.
The prosecutor's testifying.
Did you know that?
I was not privy to her testimony.
Right. Well, she did testify that she read the book from front to cover and knew all about it.
That's wonderful. But nonetheless, she reported to me that she was having difficulty in her general reading. That was one example. There were other examples as well. I would have to refer through my notes in order to find specific ones, but based upon my clinical judgment and my expertise and experience, she met that criteria.
And you can bang on it all you want, and it's still your judgment, isn't it?
Of course it's my judgment.
So, to get back to it, your judgment is based on partly on the fact that she said she had trouble reading, right?
Well, that was one factor, yes.
And did you know that she also indicated that she read her journals from beginning to end? Did you know that?
Maybe she did. She wrote them. They were familiar to her.
Right. So the bottom line is when you say that she had trouble reading, she didn't indicate that to us in cross-examination. And if that's the case, doesn't that call into doubt what you just told us?
I don't believe so, because our conversations delved into many areas relating to concentration.
Give me another area then.
Her ability, she indicated that her ability to concentrate and relax was impaired with. She was having difficulty concentrating on relaxing herself in her jail cell, and that she was not able to keep a train of thought on the scenes that she was trying to create to relax. I believe that was something that she told me.
And what you told us just now was that when she went back to her cell, she had trouble relaxing. That's what you're saying.
She had trouble concentrating on images that would help her relax.
And so you say that as difficulty concentrating, right?
Yes.
So even though the one example that you gave us about reading, she indicated otherwise, you're still going to put your 35 years and your judgment and say that this factor was met, right?
Yes.
Let's talk about number 4. Hypervigilance, right?
Yes.
What does that talk about, sir?
That talks about a tendency to be hyper aware of your surroundings.
Right. Is that, for example, being hypersensitive to the environment?
It could.
Is that, for example, being sensitive, if you will, to what people that aren't schooled say somebody is being paranoid?
No.
When they're worried about somebody snooping or looking at things?
Perhaps, but doesn't quite meet the diagnostic criteria.
Well, no, pardon?
It doesn't meet the definition.
Did you find this one or not?
That she was paranoid about her.
That she was hypervigilant.
I did find that, yes.
And why is it that you found that she was hypervigilant?
Because she reported to me that she was very sensitive to the noise in the prison. She was aware of people moving around. She never had a problem sleeping. She was a very sound sleeper. And here, every little sound and noise would disturb her. There were other elements as well. I'd have to go through my notes in order to find them.
I thought you just told us that she didn't have any trouble sleeping.
No, she told me that when before this all happened, she was a very sound sleeper. But since coming to the jail environment, she had trouble sleeping. She was hypervigilant. She had disturbed sleep.
Do you remember telling us, or me, at an interview, that she told you that she indicated she had no trouble sleeping?
I don't recall that specifically.
Well, let's go ahead and play it and see what you told us. Let's listen to Exhibit 557.
Judge, can you approach?
Go ahead and listen to Exhibit 557.
And is she now able to get free from all that without the excitement on? Well, later interviews with her indicated she had no trouble sleeping.
Did you hear yourself?
Yes, but that wasn't one of the criteria I selected.
I understand that you're saying that wasn't one of the criteria, but you did tell me that she wasn't having trouble sleeping, right?
What I was saying to you is that because of her hypervigilance, she would be easily disturbed by sounds in the area. But that wasn't the only characteristic of hypervigilance. There were many.
And I understand that, but one of the things that you specifically indicated was this lack of being able to sleep, right? Or having trouble sleeping, right?
I said that the noise was troubling her sleep. She would be more alert. In the past, she told me that she could sleep through almost anything. Here, jail noises woke her up, but in general, her sleep was fine.
Right, and which is D1, right? She had no difficulty falling or staying asleep.
That's what I said, yes.
So what other aspect, other than the sleeping, what other aspect of hypervigilance did you find?
She reported to me that she felt that her personal space needed to be left clear, that she would feel, in a sense, invaded when someone got too close to her. She reported that sometimes the sounds of the jail seemed louder than they should be, or the brightness of the lights were brighter than they normally would be. These are characteristics of hypervigilance. And putting together with other aspects of our conversation, I believe, from a clinical perspective, from my experience diagnosing post-traumatic stress disorder, that she meets the criteria for hypervigilance.
And with regard to the lights being lighter than they should be, you just told me that was one of the things.
The lights seemed very, very bright
Right.
to her.
Right, even though the lights were brighter than they should be, according to you, she didn't have any difficulty falling or staying asleep though, right?
That's correct.
And even though the noise was louder than it should have been, she didn't have any difficulty falling or staying asleep, right?
We're not making that claim.
Mischaracterized the testimony in that small clip that was played.
I don't think the question was with reference to that clip, so overruled, you may answer.
Sir?
Could you repeat your question?
You talked to us just now about the noise, and that the noise was something that made her be hypervigilant, right? The noises of the jail, right?
Not just at night, during the day as well.
And during the day, she would hear noises, and that would make her hypervigilant, right?
That was an example of being hypervigilant.
Right, and even though these noises were going on during the day and presumably at night, right? You did say
Yes.
that the jail was
Yes.
a noisy place, right?
Yes,
She still had no difficulty falling or staying asleep, according to you, right?
that's correct.
The last one under this criteria is exaggerated startle response, right?
Yes.
Did you find that, yes or no?
No.
So that's a no, right?
Correct.
So even though, in light of what we talked about, and there has to be 3 of these, correct?
No, 2.
2 of these. So even though we've talked about these issues here, and there are 2 that you didn't find, you still say, based on your 35 years of experience and having spoken with the defendant, correct?
Correct.
that even in light of what we talked about, you still find that this section, D, has been met, correct?
Yes,
Okay. There's also another section involved here, which is C, correct?
correct.
And C, again, it requires 3 of, how many certified?
3 out of 7, but I found 5.
All right. Let's talk about C. And let's talk about the last one first.
The last one. Yes.
And what does number 7 talk about, sir?
A sense of foreshortened future.
Okay. And I think that you, I know you did, you testified that with regard to that, that issue involved her feelings of suicide, right?
She indicated that she had, from the beginning, since this happened and she became aware of what had gone on, she was planning to kill herself.
Right, she was suicidal, right?
Well, in varying intents, it means different things, but her plan was to eventually kill herself.
And, sir, that's not a new thing for her, though, is it?
Is it a new thing?
Right, it's not something that, it's something that she thought of before, right?
She may have thought of it before, but this became an overwhelming thought and plan for her. She never felt that she would be going to trial. She figured somehow she would be taking her life.
And this is something that, again, in order to find this, we would have to find that this wasn't present before the trauma, right?
Well, it doesn't mean that it couldn't have been thought of or verbalized earlier in her life. The fact is that this became a predominant thought in her planning. This was brought up numerous times throughout her interview, and it was related to the time of the crime.
And I didn't ask you that, did I? I asked you whether or not this trauma has to be cannot be present before the trauma. That's one of the requirements of it, right?
Yes,
And it does say persistent, C reads, persistence, avoidance of stimuli associated with the trauma and numbing of general responsiveness not present before the trauma, right?
yes,
And in fact, she made statements that she was going to commit suicide in high school, right?
I believe so.
And she also made statements that she was going to commit suicide to Matthew McCartney, right?
Yes,
And she also, in the journals we took a look at, and in fact, one of the questions from the jurors was involving these journals and whether or not it was, in your opinion, whether it was no big deal or negative, if you will, that she was talking about suicide. Do you remember that question from them?
yes,
And so, not only from the teenage years over to Mr. McCartney, but then later on in 2008, is that when it was? 2007, she's talking about suicide, right?
yes,
Those are 3 separate instances where she's talking about suicide, right?
yes, but the focus of the reasons why differed.
I understand that the reasons may differ, but the effect is the same. When somebody wants to commit suicide, is they want to kill themselves, right?
Yes,
And you're saying that even though you had all of that before, you're saying that you still found this factor pursuant to your 35 years of experience, because in your judgment, those 3 other ones don't matter. The only one that matters are the ones that come after June 4th of 2008.
all the information is taken into account, but this became an almost obsessional plan for her to do away with herself before a trial.
And you're basing that on the defendant's statements, right?
Well, yes, of course.
And at no time when she was in the jail, was there ever any indication that she was on suicide watch, right?
No, she never had a plan.
Right. In other words, it wasn't there. You didn't find anything like that, right?
No,
So the only thing you really have to point that out to us is her word, right?
yes,
Did she ever tell you that she undertook any steps to do it?
no, she did not.
Now, we also have another section under that, which is C6. Let's talk about that. And What does C6 refer to, sir?
Restricted range of affect, for example,
Hold
unable
on,
to.
hold on, let me write it down. Is that also something called unable to have loving feelings? Is that what it says?
That's given as an example.
It
E.g.,
goes- Well, I'm just writing down what it said. And you found this one too, didn't you?
I did find that, yes.
All right, tell me what it is that she had that indicated to you that she had a restricted range of affect.
In her conversations with me, she would frequently not show the kinds of emotions that we would normally expect to see when discussing such emotionally charged issues as the topics that we discussed. That is referred to as blunted affect, or a restricted range of affect.
And that range of emotions could include laughing, right?
It could,
It could include smiling, right?
it could,
It could include giggling, right?
it could.
In fact, it has to do, if you will, with the context and the response from the person in that context,
In a
correct?
particular context, yes.
Right. So for example, you did review her conversations with this detective, didn't you?
Yes,
And in fact, at certain times, she's seen giggling in those interviews, isn't she?
yes.
So again, that's not a blunted affect, is it?
The tendency to show a blunted affect can be situationally determined. In my conversations with her, for many of the times we would talk about the specifics of the crime, her affect was not connected, was not tied in, did not modulate according to the content that I would expect someone who was involved in this way would react.
And now you're imposing your standard. You're saying the way you would expect somebody to
The way a
react.
professional would expect someone to talk about the death of someone close was not followed through with an emotional response that we would normally expect to see in other clients discussing the same type of situation.
And you're talking about somebody who kills somebody else or somebody who's had a loved one who died.
Correct.
Which one is it? Loved one who died or
Well,
a killer talking about their killing?
It doesn't matter because the affect was blunted. And what causes the blunted affect is not pertinent to the diagnosis. What is important is the person's affect, their emotional state, their inability to express a range of emotions that one would consider, that a trained professional would consider to be appropriate for the discussion, the area under discussion.
And you're such trained official, right?
Yes, I am.
mean, expert, right?
Yes.
And one of the other things that you reviewed as part of your investigation into this case is the unredacted interview of the defendant in 48 hours, right?
Yes.
And through it, as she's sitting there, she's smiling, isn't she? When she's talked about certain things, for example, involving Mr. Alexander.
Yes, but that was before she admitted to what actually happened.
Oh, so just because she was lying, it's okay to sort of smile at the lie? Is that what's going on here?
No, I'm not saying she was lying either. I'm saying that she built up a defense mechanism to help her not deal with the emotional trauma of what really happened. She created an alternative universe that she responded to. So it's not surprising that she could smile and laugh about this alternative universe because it didn't actually exist. When talking about Mr. Alexander at a later time with me, she had blunted affect.
With regard to this alternative universe that you're talking about, it's nothing more than a lie, right?
In your words, sir.
No, sir, I'm asking about you. Is it true that two individuals, based on everything that you know, is it true that two individuals came in and killed Mr. Alexander? Is that your understanding?
Objection, the youngster.
Is that your understanding?
No, that is not what happened.
Well, it's not your understanding, right? In other words, it's based on what she told you, right? You weren't there,
Well, it's my understanding.
right? And so what you're saying then is that because at that point she was lying about it, then all this give and take with the reporter isn't indicative of anything other than that she's a better liar.
I wouldn't characterize it as lying necessarily.
Well, what would you characterize the fact that somebody tells an untruth?
It could be a psychological defense mechanism to shield the person from dealing with the reality of what really happened.
It could be, but
Almost something that would occur in a dissociative identity disorder or multiple personality.
but you didn't diagnose her with that.
No, I
did you?
did not. I rejected that. But nonetheless, it's possible for a person to believe in two realities, react one way to one reality, another way to another reality. I did not ultimately keep that diagnosis.
So there's no need to talk about that diagnosis since you didn't keep it, right?
I was using it as an example.
Right, but it doesn't apply here, does it?
No, it does not.
So let's not talk about things that don't apply. Can we agree to that?
Sure.
So in this particular case, what we're talking about is a situation that you've reviewed all of these hours of conversations of her with the 48 Hours people, and you saw her giggling, you saw her talking, and to you, that doesn't have any significance because later on, when she changed her mind, she did have some sort of reaction, right?
I didn't say it had nothing to do with it. I'm just simply saying that her emotional capabilities were different from those two different versions, those two realities that she created. Well, she created an artificial reality.
How about this, again, this blunted affect? Isn't it true that when she would call, for example, her relatives, isn't it true that she would giggle and she would laugh?
I'm not privy to her conversations with her relatives.
Well, you weren't privy to her conversation with her mother, were you?
No.
But you still talked about it, right?
Yes.
It's because you read about it, right?
Yes.
Well, let's take a look at that. You've already admitted to us that in Exhibit 556, this is something that you considered in your evaluation, correct?
Yes.
Well, why don't you take a look at page 478 at the upper top. I've highlighted it for you to see whether or not that refreshes your recollection about whether or not she would laugh when she would call relatives from jail.
Yes, I see that.
And you read this before, right?
Yes.
If I may have it back. That's not a blunted affect to call from jail and laugh and giggle appropriately with a relative, is it?
No.
Objection as to mischaracterizing giggling appropriately. Dr. Samuels has no knowledge to that.
Overruled. The answer will stand.
Could you
And yet
repeat? I'm
still found this C6 factor, didn't you?
Could you repeat that, the last statement you made?
In light of everything that we've talked about, you still find the C6 factor because you believe she had a blunted affect, right?
Yes. Dealing with certain issues, her affect was definitely blended.
Let's take a look at number 5. Number 5, what is number 5 to you?
Feeling of detachment or estrangement from others.
What are you talking about there?
I'm talking about the fact that she reported to me often feeling that she was in a state of unreality, that she didn't feel tuned into the reality. She would feel, to use the word, detached from the reality, almost looking at her reality as an observer. She also reported that her thinking was oftentimes foggy and unclear, and that she would not be able to tune in to what was going on around her. This is a characteristic of psychological detachment.
Well, but there's a modifier there, isn't there? From others. Isn't that what it says?
Detachment or estrangement from others, yes.
Right, it's talking about interpersonal relationships, isn't it?
Well, that's part of it, yes.
Well, no, not part of it. Why don't you read the whole thing? And if you want, I'll show.
Feeling
What?
of detachment or estrangement from others.
It doesn't say feeling of detachment or estrangement, does it? It says from others, right?
That's correct.
So what others was she feeling detached or estranged from?
From-
I don't want to, I'm asking specifically what others she felt estranged or detached from.
She reported feeling different from the other cellmates or other individuals in the jail, and that was her world at that particular time. So she felt unable to relate to many of them. She also reported feeling this sense of fogginess and this inability to connect with people in the same way that she did beforehand. That's
And-
what was reported.
She'd never been in jail before, right?
That's true.
So it's not, in your experience, unusual for somebody who's in jail for the first time to have difficulty relating to others, right?
It's possible, yes.
Well, no, you have had 35 years of experience. You know that phenomenon, don't you?
Yes.
And so, in this case, it wouldn't be a stretch, would it, for her to have difficulty dealing, or it wouldn't be a stretch for her to have feelings of detachment or estrangement from the other prisoners, right?
It still meets the criteria.
And that's based on your examination and your 35 years of experience, right?
Correct.
Let's talk about number 4. Did you find this one too?
I beg your pardon, how did you characterize that?
Did you find this one too?
Find that one too? No, I did not.
So this is a no. If we take a look, for example, at exhibit number 544, it talks that you actually only found C3 and C6, right?
Yes, I indicated that there was an omission typographically.
And what you're saying is that it's somebody else's fault when this report came out, right?
No, it was my fault.
No, overall, the answer was.
It was my fault. I omitted typing in the number and the letter.
Did you type it yourself or did you have a typist?
Some of it was typed by someone else, some of it I typed myself.
So how do you know who typed this?
Some of it I typed by myself, and some was typed by somebody else. Different
who typed-
sections, some sections I would dictate, and they were typed by someone else. In some sections, I used my dictation software, and in other sections, I would type it myself and take the pieces and put it together, revise it over and over again, and somewhere I usually take responsibility for the final copy. However, I made an omission.
And with C3, what is that?
Inability to recall an important aspect of the trauma.
Inability to recall an important aspect of the trauma, right?
Yes.
And this is what you've been telling us is the amnesia, right?
That would be, yes, that would be an example of the amnesia.
This is the dissociative amnesia that you've been talking about, right?
Yes.
This is the fog, right?
No, this is the absence of memory.
All right, so this doesn't have anything to do with the fog, even though the fog affected her ability to recall things.
Well, can we go into a discussion of amnesia or?
No, in terms of the fog, did the fog restrict her ability to recall important aspects of the trauma?
In the beginning and the end, yes.
So it did affect her ability to recall important aspects of the trauma, right?
Yes, but the amnesia was responsible for her lack of memory about the bulk of the period of time during which the trauma was occurring.
And this finding, if you will, that she had an issue remembering this, there is no scientific test that can be conducted to determine whether or not a person actually had amnesia, right?
Well, they probably are, but not within the realm of this type of evaluation.
Well, are you saying, for example, that somebody could hook up the defendant up to some sort of machine, and that machine could tell us whether or not she actually experienced this loss?
There might be a way of doing that with scanning and electrodes implanted in the brain, but as I said, it's not something that we could use as a practical tool these days.
So these implanted items had to be in at the time of the killing, right?
No, you could test someone probably post-trauma as well. But as I said, what I'm talking about is experimental and not available to us at the time.
So-
So practically speaking, no.
No. All right. So, and there is nothing that we can, for example, look beyond her brain. There's no other area that we can look at to actually get a total assurance that what she is telling us is truthful, right?
Correct.
So we can look, for example, at the journals. We could look at them, right?
Yes, we could.
But again, that's a situation where your expertise would have to come in, right?
Yes.
We can look at, for example, conversations that she may have had with the media, right?
Correct.
And again, your expertise would have to be called in to determine whether or not she's able to recall this, right?
Correct.
I mean, you indicated that this issue involving this PTSD was something like a crater. Do you remember talking about it?
I did.
And that the event was this anxiety, right? The meteor that came in, right?
That's right.
But in that circumstance that we're talking about, the crater, people can actually go look at the crater, can't they?
Yes, that's correct.
Sure. And we can go and we look and we can see that it's big and it's got an indentation in the earth, right?
Correct.
Whereas in this particular case, you can't look into her brain and find any indentation or any indication like that to show you whether or not she's actually telling the truth about this amnesia, right?
That's the nature of psychology.
I'm not asking you if that's the nature of psychology. I'm asking you about whether or not if you sit there testifying, can you look over there and find such a key inside her brain that physically others could look at, like the crater example?
I can opine with respect to all reasonable psychological probability.
So the answer would be no then, right? You cannot.
I can respond in terms of referring to all psychological probability.
Which is basically telling me that you don't know, right?
I don't think that's what I'm saying.
Well,
could you rephrase that perhaps?
Sure, we're talking about the crater. You indicated to me that somebody could go out to the crater and look at it, right?
Correct.
And that's the PTSD, right?
That would be equivalent to the symptoms being presented
Sure.
for PTSD.
Right. If you look over at the defendant, there is no such crater, and I'm using that metaphorically speaking, there is no such crater there that would allow you to to point it to it and say, see, there's the crater, that's why she had loss of memory, right?
No, psychology is not that type of a science.
And what that means is that in terms of this issue, whether it's dissociative amnesia, which you've talked to the jury about, other questions or anything else, we're left at the mercy of her words, right?
And other information picked up from the ancillary materials that I reviewed.
Right, the ancillary materials being the journals, right?
The journals?
48 hours conversations, right?
Yes.
And text messages, all that sort of stuff, right? But again, you can't point to anything like the crater example, can you?
No, there's a difference between geological science and the science of psychology.
Right, so talk about 2. What does number 2 talk about?
It talks about efforts to avoid activities, places, or people that arouse recollections of the trauma.
All right.
Mr. Martinez, we're going to take the noon recess. Ladies and gentlemen, please be back in the designated area at 1:25. We will start promptly at that time. Please remember the admonition. You are excused.
Sir, just I'm wondering if we may have the overhead turned on. Sir, when we left off, we were talking about the second, or prong number 2 under the C, factors for post-traumatic stress disorder. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And that's not something that you found, correct?
Number 2, no.
And so that brings us up to number 1, correct?
Yes.
And this section is called persistent avoidance of stimuli associated with the trauma and the numbing of general responsiveness not present before the trauma, as indicated by 3 or more, correct?
Yes.
And the first one, what does that talk about?
Talks about efforts to avoid thoughts, feelings, or conversations associated with the trauma.
Okay? And you found this one, correct?
I did.
And what efforts did she, according to you, undertake to avoid thoughts, feelings, or conversations associated with the trauma?
I took her original story as an effort or an occurrence that separated her from the realities of the trauma And by creating this other story, it created a psychological distance between what happened that she was responsible for and what she first claimed happened when she was the victim of this, well, obviously false story about what had happened on that day.
So what you're talking about under number one is a lie. She told a lie, and based on the fact that she told a lie, that was her effort to avoid feelings, conversations associated with the killing.
I'm not characterizing it as a lie.
You're characterizing it as a story.
As a story, a defense mechanism.
You call it a defense mechanism, but this defense mechanism, as the way these things have come out, based on what you tell us about what was told later, is a story, isn't it?
Yes.
But there are other things that she did during this period of time that affect this. Are you familiar with the fact that she sent 20 irises to Mr. Alexander's grandmother?
I don't remember the number being 20, but I do remember that, yes.
And in fact, if she admitted to that, that's not an effort to avoid thoughts, feelings, or conversations associated with the killing, is it?
It's an effort to distance herself from the reality of the fact that she did the killing.
And that effort requires thinking, doesn't it?
Yes.
So in her thinking about the 20 irises, she's thinking about the killing, right?
She's thinking of the event and the actions of maintaining normalcy as a result of what had happened, in my opinion, it's very similar to what happens in a dissociative identity disorder, where a whole alternative reality exists. Now, I didn't use that diagnosis here, but as part of her defense mechanism, I believe that she created this alternative reality which insulated her from the pain of dealing with what had happened that she was responsible for, and carried on as if the alternative reality was the truth.
So bottom line is, she did think about it, right? And that's why she thought about the killing, and that's why she sent the irises, right?
I don't know whether she thought about it. There's no way that I can say.
Then why else would she send 20 irises unless she was thinking about Mr. Alexander being dead, whether it be by one story or the other?
Well, obviously sending the irises was in response to him being deceased. That's true.
Right. And she knew, according to you, there was one or two realities, right? She knew that either these two people came in and killed him or she killed him, right?
Right.
So she's thinking about the trauma then, right?
Not thinking about the trauma in terms of her being the actor or the person who did the killing.
Right. She's thinking about the trauma in terms of somebody putting the gun to her head, though, right?
That's correct.
So she is then thinking about the trauma, right?
A trauma. Right, a trauma.
Right. The trauma that she designated in the PDS, right? Under number 4.
Correct.
The other thing that she did with regard to this is that, isn't it true that she went on national television with a show called 48 Hours, right?
That's true.
She did it on 2 occasions, right?
Yes.
And during those 2 occasions, she talked about her thoughts, her feelings, and had a conversation associated with the killing, right?
Yes.
So now we have 2 examples where she's thinking about the killing, right?
Well, we don't know what she was thinking.
You don't think that when she's asked about Travis Alexander by a correspondent that she's not thinking about the killing? What could she possibly be thinking about then?
The alternatives to the fact that she killed him.
But she's thinking about the trauma. He's dead, right?
She's thinking about the trauma. That's right.
This here just says efforts to avoid thoughts, feelings, or conversations associated with the trauma. It says that, right?
That's right. It says that.
And that comes straight from DSM-4, right?
That's right.
And you said that that was the Bible, right?
Absolutely.
And so it doesn't say, with regard to the trauma, it doesn't say whether she killed him or not, does it?
It also doesn't say absolutely no thoughts whatsoever. It says efforts to avoid thoughts, feelings, or conversations associated with the trauma. Efforts. These efforts may not always be successful.
And that's not my question. My question here doesn't distinguish the trauma, does it?
No.
Which is the point that you were trying to make to me with regard to the PDS, right?
Correct.
The trauma doesn't matter, right?
In that case, yes.
Yeah, so why does it not matter with the PDS and it does matter here? Aren't you being a bit selective?
I'm not sure I understand the point you're
Sure,
trying
you do
to make.
understand the question. The PDS, you told us it doesn't matter what the trauma is, right?
At the time that I scored it, correct. Yes.
Well, no, even now you're telling us when you testified that the trauma doesn't matter.
The trauma did not matter. It was her
Right.
it was her internal perceptions of the emotional reactions to whatever trauma occurred, which is what I measured.
And the trauma doesn't matter is what you said. And so you said you could still use that test and don't have to rescore it because the trauma doesn't matter. That's what you said
That's
in
right.
response to a jury's question, right?
Yes.
So if that analysis applies for the PDS, you're saying, that analysis does not apply to the DSM-4, even though the PDS was used to corroborate the post-traumatic stress disorder, right?
I'm afraid I'm not getting the point.
Sustained.
Sir, you did use the PDS to support or corroborate your finding that this was post-traumatic stress disorder, right?
Correct.
And you said, with regard to that, the trauma doesn't matter, right?
Yes.
With regard to this, by its own definition, it says effects to avoid thoughts, feelings, or conversations associated with the trauma, right?
Yes.
It doesn't say first or second story, does it?
No, it doesn't. It talks about the trauma of being either, at one point, an observer to the killing or being the actor in the killing.
Right. So when you start trying to make this distinction with me about she doesn't know whether or not she killed him, it's just trauma that we're talking about, whether or not it was her that killed him or somebody else, right?
That's the point I'm making, yes.
So we get back to the 48 hours interview when you're saying, we discussed this and the question was, well, isn't it true that she discussed thoughts, feelings, conversations associated with the trauma in the 48 hours interview?
Yes.
So again, that speaks against what's in number 1, doesn't it?
I'm sorry, I don't see it that way.
Right, you wouldn't see that way because you have feelings for the defendant, right?
I beg your pardon, sir.
Hold it. The objection.
It's argumentative, but totally
Thank you.
inappropriate.
We approach, Your Honor.
You may.
You don't see it that way, right? It's your opinion, right?
Yes, it is.
And
As well
this-
as my professional opinion.
It's your professional opinion based on these 35 years that you've been telling us about, right?
That's correct.
Sir, one of the other things that we know in this case is that the defendant spoke with Leslie Udy. You're familiar with that, right?
Could you refresh my memory?
Sure.
Mr. Udy?
Objection to interference, go.
Approach, please.
Sir, we had information that the defendant, after traveling to Utah, spoke to Leslie Udy about Mr. Alexander. Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
And in fact, one of the questions I think that you might have addressed involved the fact that she told Miss Udy about the fact that her children were going to play with Mr. Alexander's children. Do you remember that?
I do.
That's not avoiding thoughts, feelings, or conversations associated with the trauma, is it?
Well, it is.
How could it possibly be? Because isn't the person that was killed Travis Alexander?
It was.
Isn't it true that Travis Alexander was the subject of that conversation that we just discussed?
Yes, but she could not have had that conversation if she was admitting to the fact that she killed him. And so her conversation was her way of avoiding thoughts, feelings, or conversations associated with the trauma At that point, the trauma in her mind, her perception, was that she did it, no matter what she told me.
But isn't it true in that conversation that she's the one that brought up Mr. Alexander? Are you aware of that?
Well, I can only aware of what I read. I don't know for sure.
Overruled.
Are you aware of that? Yes or no?
I don't know if she was the one who brought it up, but there was a conversation to that effect.
Let's assume that it was her that brought it up. Wouldn't that be contrary to what we have listed in number 1?
No, sir, it would not be.
The other thing that we know is that she sent the letter to the family. Are you aware of that?
To the whom?
The family of
Yes.
Mr. Alexander.
Yes, I am.
Again, she sent this letter to the family talking about the killing, right? You've read that, right?
Yes.
It's an 18-page letter, right?
Yes.
And it's a very long, detailed letter, isn't it?
Yes.
That doesn't show, she had to go to the effort of addressing it, didn't she?
Yes.
She had to go to the effort of getting it mailed, right?
Yes.
And she had to go through the effort of finding the address, right?
I don't know whether she had the address or not, but yes.
If she did have the address, she would have to have addressed it, correct?
Correct.
So that is not an effort to avoid thoughts, feelings, or associations, conversations associated with the trauma, is it?
It is, if the trauma was killing Mr. Alexander.
Well, no, the
Because-
trauma here, again, we keep going back to this. Isn't the trauma that Mr. Alexander is dead? By whatever means?
Well, that's one aspect of the trauma, but the reality is her experience was that she did do the killing, and her perceptions and her emotions are tied into what actually occurred, not the story that was made up as a way of separating herself from the horror of what had happened on that day.
Going back to the PDS, you told us that the trauma didn't matter for purposes of your assessment, right?
That's correct,
But
because
you're
what the
right.
PDS measures were her emotional states and her perceptions of the trauma, whatever happened. And at the time that it was administered, she was telling this alternative story, but the reality was she was responding to the emotional components, which is what the PDS measures, as a person who did commit this crime.
And killing Mr. Alexander involved trauma, right?
Involved what?
Killing Mr. Alexander involved trauma, right?
Yes.
Whether it be by her hand or somebody else's hand, it involved trauma,
That's
right?
right.
So this is what this is talking about, whether her hand or somebody else's hand, isn't it? It doesn't distinguish, it doesn't say, but the trauma has to be associated with the killer killing the person, does it?
Question asked and answered.
As I indicated earlier, the trauma involved the killing of Mr. Alexander. She experienced that regardless of the story that she was telling at the time. And so her psychological reactivity and her psychological defense mechanisms were helping her avoid the thoughts, feelings, and conversations associated with her having been the perpetrator of that killing.
My question is, trauma doesn't distinguish between the killer or somebody who was a witness, does it?
Well, that aspect of the trauma, correct. That's
It
correct.
does not. The other thing that we know is that you've read her journals, right?
I did.
And you've read the journals post-killing of Mr. Alexander, right?
Yes.
And in it, she goes out of her way to talk about Mr. Alexander, doesn't she?
Well, it's for the exact same reason.
But the bottom line is she does go out of her way, which of course expresses her thoughts and feelings in that journal, right?
Correct. But not,
About the trauma, right?
yes.
The other thing that we know is that Mr. Alexander had a memorial service. I believe she said either July 15th or July 16th are her words. You're aware of that,
I
right?
am.
And she attended the memorial service. You're aware of that, right?
I believe so.
And if she attended that memorial service, certainly that is not an effort to avoid thinking, feeling, or talking about the trauma, is it?
It was her way of avoiding dealing with the fact that she was responsible for that trauma by allowing herself to go through life at that time in a manner consistent with having been a victim of the trauma.
Now
not dealing with the fact that she did perpetrate the trauma.
Now you're adding an extra element here, responsibility, aren't you? You're adding responsibility to the word trauma, aren't you? You're saying, well, she's trying to deal with her responsibility in this issue, and that's how she chose to deal with it.
Well, perhaps I misspoke there.
And this is irrespective of responsibility, isn't it?
An individual's inner perceptions is not independent of the nature of the trauma.
And all of this is based on what she told you, right?
That's correct.
And so you know that she goes to the memorial service, so she has to think about going to the memorial service, right?
Well, yes.
And so she has to book a flight, right?
Yes.
Did you know that it was a flight that
Well,
she
I didn't know
took?
it was a flight when she got
Do you
there
want to see the
somehow.
receipt?
Pardon me?
Do you want to see the receipt that shows she took a flight?
I don't need to see the receipt.
All right. The other thing is, it requires that she make her way from the airport over to Mesa, which is where she told us the memorial service was. It requires some thought there, right?
Yes.
Do you know whether or not she went over to the house during the time that she was here at the memorial service?
I don't know that.
And if she had gone over there, wouldn't that indicate something to you that she is doing anything but avoiding thoughts about the killing?
I don't know that she went to the house.
But assuming she did, if you assume that she went over to the house with somebody named Aaron, assume that, wouldn't that indicate that she was not attempting to avoid thinking about the trauma?
If her actions were part of an avoidance reaction, a defense mechanism, a dissociative reality, then it would be consistent with going to that site because she wouldn't have been responding as if she was the perpetrator. And so, again, I don't know that she did go over there, but if you have something that I can read to confirm that, I'd be appreciative of that.
That would make a difference for you?
Well, I'd like to
If,
see
for
that. Yeah, I
example,
don't
somebody
remember.
named Aaron Mortensen went over there with her?
I beg your pardon?
If somebody actually went over there to the crime scene with her afterwards? That would make-
Well, I'm at this point, I don't recall what the details were. I'm assuming that you're a man of your word, and what you're telling me is actual, so I'll go along with that.
But here again, we're talking about trauma. It doesn't distinguish between responsibility. It doesn't talk about responsibility. It just talks about trauma, doesn't it?
Well, there are different kinds of trauma, and there
Right.
are different
And-
levels of trauma.
And you've told us that it doesn't make any difference in the trauma experienced by a police officer, right? It doesn't make any difference, does it? If it's a police officer or her, right? In terms of PTSD.
Well, it's a person's reactions to a trauma that determines whether or not they develop PTSD.
Didn't you just tell us when you were asked by the jurors, there was a question involving, are you saying that the defendant's PTSD is the same as that of a police officer? And you said that it was?
No, what I said was that it met the same criteria. It's not caused by the same factors,
Right.
but it has the same characteristics. Indeed, all cases of PTSD all fall under the same diagnostic criteria.
Right, because the trauma doesn't look at the responsibility of it, does it? In other words, it doesn't look as to whether you are rightful in doing it as opposed to wrongful in doing it, right?
It has an impact on one's perceptions of the intensity of the trauma.
Right. But whether or not a person has this intensity of this PTSD, it is PTSD, whether it's slight PTSD or strong PTSD, right?
Correct.
So when you say that the police officer's PTSD may not be as strong as hers, it's still PTSD, right?
It still falls under the diagnostic criteria, yes.
Right. So that the trauma, in other words, whether you are killing wrongfully or rightfully, in your mind, it's still trauma that triggers PTSD, right?
Both would be trauma, but of a different nature.
Sure, but it's trauma, right?
Yes.
And the same analysis applies to somebody in war in Afghanistan. You told us that, right?
Yes.
As it does to the defendant, right?
Yeah, in terms of the diagnosis of PTSD.
Sure. And C1 illustrates that point, doesn't it?
Correct.
So, with regard to that, one of the things that we know is that she talked in the journals about Mr. Alexander, right?
Yes.
She talked over and over about him, didn't she?
Yes.
Objection, asked and answered.
Oh, that's not an avoidance of feelings or thoughts about him, is it?
Yes, it can be, because if she's talking about him in flowing terms and how wonderful he was, it's a way of insulating her from the harsh reality that she did the killing. And so that method of dealing with his demise is very different than someone saying, oh my gosh, I've done this horrible thing, and I take all full responsibility for that. It's a different way of dealing with a similar situation. But it's very different in terms of the internal perceptions and in terms of the emotional reactivity of the client.
It requires thinking to write down what she did in her journals, right?
Yes.
And it requires thinking about the trauma, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
Irrespective of whether it's rightful or wrongful, it requires that. So there was nothing that required her, for example, she wasn't attending a course in school that required her to write in those journals, right?
Correct.
It was a voluntary effort on her part, correct?
She has used journal writing as a way of dealing with her life since she was in school.
That's
This
not
is an
my question.
extension of that. This is not a new activity.
It's not my question. Nobody forced her to write in those journals,
No
did
one
they?
forced her to write.
And it required her to think about it before she wrote whatever she wrote in those journals, right?
Sustained.
Well, and it wasn't that she just had one entry in there. She had many entries, right?
Yes.
And she continued on up till at least a day or two until her arrest, right?
Correct.
The other thing, sir, is that shortly after this killing, the defendant called Mr. Alexander's answering machine. Are you aware of that?
Yes.
That's not an effort to avoid thinking about the trauma, is it?
It's consistent, however, with her psychological condition of having created an alternative reality which allowed her to function in life because it was a way that she was able to deny having been the perpetrator of the crime.
In terms of that telephone call, it required her to pick up the telephone to make the call, didn't it?
Yes.
It required, whether or not she had him on speed dial or otherwise, it required her to manually do something by pushing at least one button, correct?
Sure.
And it required her, while she was on the phone, to speak, right? So even though the trauma had already occurred, it required her to express her thoughts, feelings in a one-sided conversation on the telephone, right?
She did do that.
Additionally, didn't she also send an email?
Yes.
And this email was sent to Mr. Alexander's account, wherever the account was, right?
Yes.
And so that required her to think about sitting down and composing it. Is she?
Those actions are consistent with someone who is avoiding the thought of having been the perpetrator of the killing.
But is she thinking about the trauma? I'm not asking about it doesn't say killing there, right? Does it?
No.
In fact, it could be a car accident where nobody was killed, right? So trauma just indicates the event, whatever that event was, right?
That's right.
The other thing is that, didn't she also send some text messages over to him?
I believe so.
And these text messages were after the killing, right?
Yes.
She wasn't avoiding thinking about him when she sent those text messages, was she?
It was a method that is consistent with her behaving in a way that reduced the impact of the trauma on her, because by engaging in that alternative behavior, she was not having to get in touch with her feelings of responsibility for his demise.
She was trying to stage a scene, is what she told us.
Well, that's what she did. She didn't tell that to me.
This characterizes her testimony.
Overruled.
Wouldn't that be inconsistent if that's what they're doing, staging a scene? Wouldn't that be inconsistent with avoiding thoughts? In fact, you're actually really thinking about the trauma then if you're trying to stage a scene, aren't you?
Well, that was not told to me.
Well, let's assume then that that's what she said, that she was trying to stage the scene. Wouldn't that indicate that just the opposite?
Not necessarily.
Objection, Judge. May we approach?
You may. Stating the last objection, the jury is directed to disregard the last question and answer. You may continue.
Sir, with regard to avoiding responsibility, isn't the idea, if somebody wants to avoid responsibility involving the trauma, actually the antithesis of what you have here?
No.
Avoiding responsibility on something, isn't that saying something that you are thinking about the trauma, but you just don't want to be held responsible?
It doesn't say responsibility. The criteria do not say responsibility.
It does say efforts to avoid thoughts, feelings, or conversations associated with the trauma, right?
Yes.
And if someone's thinking about their responsibility, isn't that contrary to avoiding thoughts associated with the trauma?
Yes. There's a difference, however, between the trauma of observing someone being killed and recognizing that you killed the individual.
And I understand that you keep saying that, but the DSM-4 doesn't say that, does it?
The definition of trauma is not contained within that particular criteria.
I understand that now you're trying to be a wordsmith involving trauma, but
Characterization.
Sustained.
with regard to the word trauma, are you saying that the word trauma means specifically that it has to apply to somebody who killed somebody unlawfully? Is that what you're
No,
saying?
of course not.
Right. It can be lawful or unlawful, right?
Correct.
Just as in the example that you gave in Afghanistan where a soldier killed somebody, right?
Correct.
That's a lawful killing, right?
Yes.
As opposed to another killing outside of this courtroom where somebody takes a gun and shoots somebody, right?
That's right.
And so trauma applies to both of them, doesn't it?
It does, but there's a different essence to each of those traumas.
And-
People react emotionally differently to those types of traumas.
They may react emotionally differently, but anybody who is diagnosed with PTSD has to walk through these portals here in DSM-4, don't they?
Yes, absolutely.
And did you ever work for the military?
Not extensively, no.
Well, do you have any information about how the military does its thing with regard to diagnosing somebody with PTSD?
Objection, on this vote.
Approach. You may continue.
Doesn't the military, when they, if you know, when they diagnose somebody with PTSD, don't they follow the criteria in the DSM-4?
Yes.
Same thing with a police officer that you talked about, maybe in the Times article that you talked about. If that officer was found to have been diagnosed with PTSD, he would have, by necessity, have been diagnosed pursuant to DSM-4, correct?
Right. I don't believe the officer was diagnosed with PTSD, however.
But assuming that he had. Oh,
Yes.
you said that you've worked with police officers
Yes,
before,
the same
right?
criteria would apply.
So one of the other things that you talked about was this email or this instant messaging involving the defendant and Mr. Alexander, where he called her 3 salacious names. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Do you also remember the other part of that conversation where Mr. Alexander was upset and he told her,
Objection, Judge. Maybe approach.
Sir, do you remember saying that you reviewed a conversation where the victim, Mr. Alexander, called the defendant certain names? Do you remember that?
I
when
do
Miss-
recall that, yes.
And it was Miss Wilmot that asked you that, right? Do you
Yes.
remember that? And you were able to tell us that you had actually reviewed that, right?
Yes.
But as part of that same conversation, isn't it true that Mr. Alexander was upset and said, do you remember reading that he was nothing more than a dildo with a heartbeat to Miss Arias? Do you remember reading that part?
I do.
So that's part of the same conversation, isn't it?
Well, I believe it occurred in the same time frame.
No, not the same time frame. Do you want to take a look at it and see, to refresh your recollection to see?
Yes,
what
that would be helpful.
This is Exhibit 275. Go ahead and take your time and read it. This is that, and then the other ones are.
Okay.
I want you to review the whole thing to see if it includes those words previously also. That were
The other
used.
words?
Or do you just recognize it by looking at it?
No, I read the part that you had
Go ahead
referred
and
me
take
to.
a look at it, find the other section.
Okay.
You may want to start at the beginning.
And what is it specifically you're asking me to find?
I'm just asking you to read it to see if it's the same conversation where he used those three names so that
Okay.
you can follow.
Okay, I did come across the three-hole wonder.
Sure, don't, just read it. Did I ask you to tell me? Just read it, okay?
The
Once
whole
you're
thing?
done reading,
Okay.
let me know.
All right, I didn't want to take up the first time.
terms of where the complaint by Mr. Alexander appears, would you say it comes, the way you were reading it from this way forward, that it comes after he makes the derogatory comments about her?
I think it came after.
Well, why don't you take a look, okay? This thing about, so his comments about her came after the derogatory comment about himself being a...
Objection to finish. These are out of sequence. We just discussed.
Approach close.
And so these statements were made as a part of the same conversations, weren't they?
Yes.
In fact, he's complaining to her about her taking advantage of him sexually, right?
Objection. Beyond the scope, relevant.
Overruled.
Right?
Yes.
And, sir, does the date of this conversation, the one that you reviewed prior to coming to court, did it have a date on it?
I'm sure that it did, but I don't remember the date.
Was the date important to you?
Well, the relative time frame was important, yes.
And the one that you read did have a date and time, right?
I believe it did.
Take a look at Exhibit 275 to see if that, it may or may not refresh your recollection as to the date and time of this conversation.
$526.08.
Well, Without saying it, did it refresh your recollection or not?
Honestly, no.
Okay, then that's fine.
Doesn't remember.
Okay. One of the things that you talked to us about in response to a juror question was this fight or flight syndrome. Do you remember
Yes.
talking about that? And one of the things that you said was that, and you analogized it to animals. Do you remember saying that?
Yes.
That the first thing that happens is there's this flight, correct?
There's an impulse to flee.
Right, and that's the first thing, in your opinion, that happens, right?
As a rule, yes.
And then if the animal can't get away, cornered, so to speak, then there's this instinct to fight, right?
Yes.
And this fighting is instinctual, is what you said, correct?
Yes.
And however, with animals, as soon as the fight is over, the vanquished is gone, then that ends the encounter, doesn't it?
Yes.
The winner, if you will, of this battle, whatever it was, doesn't then stick around and do other things with regard to the other animal that it's vanquished, does it?
Typically not.
Typically no means they just go about their business after that, right?
After recouping from their wounds, yes.
If they have any wounds, right? They may not have any wounds, right?
That's possible too.
So what they do is they're done, they move, and they go away, right?
Yes.
And they don't stick around, nosing around to try to take advantage of the dead carcass or anything like that, right?
Well, some animals kill for food.
Right.
And so
No,
they would consume the carcass.
But that's not the situation that we have here. According to you, we have a situation where there's an attacker, right? And then the other animal flees first, right? According to what you explained to us, right?
In that hypothetical,
Right,
yes.
that's what we were talking about. In that hypothetical, once the winner is determined, let's assume by death, they don't stick around, do they?
No.
They take off, right?
Yes.
Could it be, sir, that in this particular case, with regard to everything that we've seen, for example, your finding of PTSD, some of your findings of the elements and your scoring of the PDS and your Milan test, could it be, sir, that you looked at those results and because of the fact that it appears you're not objective anymore, that perhaps that could have colored the way you viewed your conversations and your results under the PTSD?
What could have colored my opinion?
Didn't you tell us that you had compassion for the defendant?
We're trained in empathy. Psychologists are trained in empathy. That is, the capacity to get into the minds and feelings of the client, to assist them, and to help understand when you do an evaluation. It is not necessarily compassion, even though Webster may say that. It is certainly not sympathy. And we are very, very carefully trained not to allow our empathic listening to lead us into any kind of over-identification with the client. That is what psychologists are trained for, sir. We are trained to be neutral observers of either an evaluation situation or when doing psychotherapy in a psychotherapeutic situation. We are trained not to over-identify with the client. It's crucial training.
Do you remember in a response to a question and follow-up by the defense counsel that you said that you had compassion?
I have been accused of being a compassionate person.
And sir, didn't you also say when you and I were talking about it that you felt sorry, at least during that first interview with the defendant?
No, I didn't say I felt sorry.
Did you use the word sorry in connection with the first interview with the defendant?
I don't remember saying that.
Do you remember that you used the word sorry when we were discussing the Webster's definition?
Well, we were talking about semantics at that point, so I may have, but that's not the context in which you're using it now.
Is that yes or no? Do you remember using the word sorry?
I don't remember using the word sorry.
And with regard to the word compassion, do you remember that you were the one that introduced it into this conversation?
That's right.
And isn't it true, sir, that this, to use your word, compassion, entered into your evaluation in this case?
No, what I said was that I have been accused of being a compassionate person. Empathy factored into this evaluation, as it would with any person I work with, because we are trained to be empathic listeners, but we are also trained to remain completely objective in doing our work, whether it's psychotherapeutic or evaluative.
And you're saying that you were trained to have this empathy, right?
I don't think that people are trained as much as a tendency to be an empathic person is brought out and then reinforced and modified by our training.
You were saying, though, just now, that you were trained to have empathy for the person that you are assessing, right? Isn't that what you just said?
We are trained to become empathic listeners.
Empathic listeners means you have empathy, correct? While
That's
listening.
right. We use empathy as a tool for evaluative purposes and for therapeutic purposes.
And in terms of this empathy or this compassion, whatever word you want to use, this is part of your training, right?
Yes.
Isn't good record keeping, for example, such as detailing what it was that you found with regard to PTSD and writing it out, isn't that something that's also, for example, exhibit number 544? Isn't it also part of training that you're accurate as to the subsections that you're finding and when you write them out? Isn't there some training for that?
Well, absolutely.
And isn't there some training that indicates that that being accurate is one of the things that's sacrosanct in this business?
Yes, I omitted a few letters and numbers, and the rest of my report, had it been read, maybe I'm sure you read it, is filled with accuracy.
I'm saying, though, isn't that part of your training?
Yes.
Right? Isn't it also part of your training in the PDS that you need to score it effectively or accurately, right?
Accurately, I did score it accurately for the portions of the test that were pertinent to my use of the test.
I understand, but you came up with 3 different numbers. You came up with 15, 16, and 17, correct?
Those numbers didn't matter because I did not use that data, and it had nothing to do with the use of the PDS test as a confirmation for my diagnosis.
Yes or no? 15, 16, and 17 are 3 different numbers.
They are 3 different numbers. Yes.
And you are taught to be very accurate with regard to the results in these tests, right?
And if the results were critical, they would have been checked several times.
Sir, isn't it true that you are trained to be accurate in your results?
Yes.
Sir? So that you've been telling us with regard to this issue involving the defendant and that you had received all this training about having empathy, compassion, but not letting it affect you, right?
Yes.
And you've also been telling us about the training and how the training is with regard to recording and how you attempted to follow that. And in your 35 years, you had training in how to keep reports and records straight, right?
Yes.
You weren't successful with the records and the reports, were you? You weren't accurate.
A typographical error is not equivalent to being a neutral, empathic listener.
I'm not asking about that. I'm asking, although you had training, you still failed in being accurate. We're looking at exhibit number 544. You weren't accurate there.
I admit a mistake was made in typing.
And just like you've had your 35 years of training, you made a mistake. Just like you had your 35 years of being compassionate and empathic, isn't it true that in this case, you lost your objectivity?
Objection.
Absolutely not.
Overruled.
Absolutely not.
I don't have anything else.
All right, looks like we have one additional juror question. Are there any other questions from the jury? Counsel, please approach. Ms. Wilmot.
Dr. Samuels, you were just asked by the state about the conversation that occurs by instant message that you were just reviewed.
Yes.
And you were asked about whether or not you remembered the statement that Travis or Mr. Alexander felt like he was a dildo with a heartbeat, right?
Yes.
You have also, in review of this case, you've listened to an audio tape of basically a sex tape, right?
Yes.
Where they're having phone sex.
Yes.
And during that conversation where Mr. Alexander is talking about what he wants from Miss Arias and talking about his particular sexual desires, anywhere on that tape does it appear that he feels like he's being used?
No.
Anywhere on that tape does it appear that he didn't want to have any conversations like phone sex like that?
No.
Did he ever appear unwilling?
No.
You were asked questions about avoiding the trauma and avoiding the trauma of killing Travis
Yes.
just a few minutes ago. If she's avoiding the trauma, does that mean avoiding thinking about what actually happened?
She's doing anything in her power to avoid reacting emotionally to what has happened.
So in doing so, if she has a conversation with Leslie Udy about something that can never happen, like Travis's children playing with Jodi's children someday down the road, is that avoidance or is that thinking about the trauma?
It's not thinking about the trauma. It's more like avoidance of the trauma.
And why is it more like avoidance?
Because it's dealing with an unreality. It's not dealing with the fact that I killed Mr. Alexander. It's a way of putting an obstacle between what's going on in her life at the moment and the reality of what happened.
And in going to the memorial and paying her respects at the memorial, is that a way of avoiding what actually happened?
Absolutely. It's living in a fantasy world.
And when she journals after June 4th, and she journals about nice things about Mr. Alexander, trying to remember him in a nice way, is that avoiding what actually happened on June 4th?
Yes.
And when she calls him and leaves a voicemail, she's not talking on the voicemail about what just happened, right?
Correct.
Sustained.
Is she talking about on the voicemail what just happened?
No.
No, and is she in fact talking about things that didn't happen?
Correct.
And is that avoiding the reality of what she did on June 4th?
Yes, in my opinion.
Same thing with her email.
The same thing with my email and my professional opinion, yes.
And in sending flowers to Travis's grandmother, again, like showing respects at the memorial, is that something that is avoiding what actually happened on June 4th?
It's avoiding coming to terms with what she was responsible for on June 4th.
Okay. You were asked questions about her being suicidal,
Yes.
and with regard to her journal writing, did she express bouts of depression?
Yes, she did. She suffered from bouts of depression.
All right. And to your knowledge, was there ever any type of intervention or anything needed during her high school because of any type of suicidal thoughts?
To my knowledge, there was never an actual suicidal attempt.
All right. And once you spoke to her after June 4th of 2008, what was her ideation about suicide at that point?
Well, she didn't have a specific plan, but she said it was part of her plan not to live long enough to go to trial.
And if she were to have written letters to her family members saying goodbye, and have written a letter where she drew a tombstone and wrote what she wanted to say, is that further evidence that she's actually thinking about suicide?
Yes.
Sustained.
It was, may we approach?
Some additional questions for you. In your office, do you have books that you would willingly offer to patients free of charge?
Yes.
Are you able to view external information in this case, such as websites, news broadcasts, or any other medium?
I have assiduously avoided any contact with the media.
Did Jodi tell you that she had purchased a gun in July of 2008 intending to kill herself?
No.
Did she tell you about a plan to kill herself with a razor in jail?
No.
What is the difference between covering up and creating an alternative reality?
Covering up is a voluntary action. It's creating an alibi for yourself. The alternative reality is a psychological process known as a defense mechanism, and it occurs through subconscious forces. The individual who is so afflicted by that oftentimes is not even aware of the depth of their distortion, of their cognitive distortion.
Follow up, Ms. Wilmot.
Doctor, with regard to the defense mechanism that you
Yes.
just talked about, the defense mechanism, is that that's part of creating an alternate reality?
Yes.
And when somebody creates an alternative reality, does that help them to not have to deal with what the reality is?
Correct. It insulates them from the feelings associated with the worst part of the trauma.
Okay. And when this happens, when our minds use this as a defense mechanism to avoid thinking about what really happened, is there often associated with that acute stress?
Yes.
How is that associated?
Well, it's the stress that's driving the distortion, the creation of the distortion. Once the stress is removed, very often there's no need for the distortion any longer, and the client is better able to face reality.
Okay, so saying that, if the stress is removed, let's talk about specifically with Jodi, then if the stress of June 4th of 2008 is removed on June 5th, then why is there this defense mechanism occurring when she speaks to Detective Flores in the beginning, or when she's sending an email to Travis?
Well, the stress isn't gone just because the next day occurs.
Okay.
She hasn't dealt with it. She hasn't processed that. There are still gaps in her memory as to what happened. But the fact remains that as long as a person is in conflict and is dealing with such repressed feelings, the possibility of this alternative reality developing does exist. In its most extreme form, it would take the form of a dissociative identity disorder, but that was not the case here, but that's the best example that I can give.
Okay, so you said as long as the person is still in conflict.
The person is in conflict, the person is still experiencing distress, the person is still experiencing the physiological effects of stress. Yes, it would very likely sustain that defense mechanism.
Okay, and so is that something, would you consider Jodi still being in conflict when she's not able to deal with the fact of what happened on June 4th? Is that the kind of conflict you're talking about?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so can somebody be in that type of conflict then until the point of a year, even years?
Oh, it can happen. Yes, it certainly can happen.
All right, and when Jodi eventually, bless you, when Jodi eventually came out of this conflict and was able to actually tell you and tell her attorney what happened on June 4th of 2008, how did she feel?
Objection. Characterizing, actually.
Sustained.
When she told you what she says actually happened on June 4th, and the times after that, how did she feel about being able to release that information finally?
Approach, please.
When Jodi talked to you about what she says actually happened on June 4th of 2008, and times after that, how did she feel about being able to release that information?
She told me that she felt as if a tremendous pressure, a tremendous weight had been lifted from her shoulders.
And is that further evidence or is that further support for you of a defense mechanism versus covering up?
Yes.
When you were speaking to her about, whenever she would talk to you about the thoughts of killing herself, okay, that's what we're going to talk about for a second. If she would have given you a plan, that she actually had a plan to do, what would you have done with that information?
Well, if a client gives you a plan for suicide, then you must take immediate steps. And depending upon the circumstances, you would contact the appropriate individuals. That could be, if they're at large, it could be a family member, it could be their doctor, it could be an emergency suicide line. In case of the jail, had that occurred, I would have contacted the jail authorities, the medical department, and alerted them to this possibility, as well as her attorney.
And if she would have talked to you about the fact that she did actually have a plan to kill herself and was going to use a razor and went so far as actually trying to cut herself so that it was something that she did do, if she had told you that, is that something then that you would have had to have been on alert for with the jail?
Absolutely.
And when the jail goes on alert that somebody, an inmate, might actually be might actually try to commit suicide, do you have knowledge as to what the jail is going to do with that person?
I do.
What do they do?
Well, they put the person on suicide watch, where they're monitored every few minutes. They would have a consult with the psychiatrist. Medication evaluation would be done, possibly placing the individual on antidepressant medication, although antidepressant medication doesn't begin working immediately, but at least it would be initiated. And mostly they would be very closely observed and probably placed in isolation.
All right, and so when you talk about being closely observed, that means they lose any semblance of privacy that they might have.
That is
right?
correct.
And when you talk about being in isolation, that means they lose any type of social interaction.
Sustained.
Do they lose any type of social interaction when somebody is placed in isolation?
They have no social interaction.
Okay, and when somebody is placed for suicide watch, do they also take everything away from them?
The person is, yes, everything is taken away from the individual, sometimes in extreme cases, even their clothing. Although I don't know that would be the case here, but nonetheless, everything that is potentially a risk is taken away. So you're really isolated.
So when you talk about that in some cases they'll take their clothing away because potentially they can strangle themselves, right?
That's correct. They can hang themselves with their clothing.
And so hang themselves. And so that's why they would take their clothing away.
That's right.
In your experience with what you've seen happen to people who have any type of a report of a plan of suicide, is it somewhat humiliating for the person?
Objection, the scope of the question.
Sustained.
Judge, may we approach?
You may proceed.
So if there's any report of suicide, the jail takes it seriously. Is that what you're saying?
Very seriously, yes. They do a good job.
And what they do to somebody after that report can be dehumanizing.
Objection, meeting beyond the scope of the question.
Overruled, you may answer.
The consequences can be somewhat dire for the individual, as they are always suspect of engaging in potential suicide behavior again. There may be changes to their living arrangements. Sometimes, I know of cases, again, in the men's jail, I don't know so much about the women's jail, but where they're placed in isolation after that. So the outcome is not predictable.
And you said you were asked the question about when patients come to see you in your office, if you've ever given them books.
Oh, yes.
And is that something that you do?
Well, that's just the way that I did my work. I would buy a carton of books that I felt were appropriate. And especially in cases where individuals couldn't afford to buy the book, I would give it to them to help them get started in their self-help aspect of their therapy. And similarly, when I did evaluations for people, because I could not serve as a therapist, I would sometimes give them a self-help book if I felt it would be useful for them. But that would be just something that I did in my practice.
All right, so people who come to see you in your office, you said that you would give them a self-help book and that would be part of therapy?
If they came to me for therapy, it could be, yes.
Okay, and if they came to you for therapy, is that something that then you would follow up with them during the therapeutic sessions?
Oh, absolutely, and we would use the book perhaps as a guideline for some of the therapeutic interventions. They would have homework assignments based upon books and workbooks. There are a lot of books, not just one. And they would be given homework assignments that sometimes were key to the book and sometimes not key to the book.
Okay, and then with evaluations that you're doing where you're not doing therapy, did you also give books to people who you were doing evaluations for?
On occasion, if I felt it might be helpful to them.
All right, and did you ever follow up with those people when it's an evaluative
Never.
process? Okay, all right, thank you. Nothing further, Judge.
Martinez, follow up.
Sir, did you gain some knowledge from some other area since our cross-examination? Did you? In the area involving the jail?
Did I gain some knowledge?
Yes, did you go out and do some research?
No.
Well, do you remember we were talking about the book and your gift of the book to the defendant? Do you remember that?
Yes.
And do you remember that you blurted out during cross-examination, well, she was suicidal? Do you remember saying that?
Objection is characterized as testimony.
Overruled.
I didn't say she was suicidal.
Did you say that she wanted to commit suicide?
She said that she did not plan to be around for the duration of this process.
Are you saying, sir, that you didn't use the word suicide when we were talking about the book? Yes or no?
I don't recall. I may have, but I don't recall.
Yeah. And if the record reflects that you did use the word suicide, sir, would you have any reason to doubt that?
Objection argumentative.
Overruled.
No.
So if you use the word suicide with regard to the issue involving the book, do you remember that the prosecutor then followed up and said to you, well, did you report it to any of the officers in the Maricopa County jail system? Do you remember me asking that?
I do.
And do you remember that you told me back then, well, I don't know anybody to report it to?
Objection, Judge. Can we ask that the prosecutor not yell at the
I'm going to object to the speaking objection. She can.
Sustained to the speaking objection. If you wish to approach, you may.
Okay, then can we approach?
Did you tell us at that time, well, I don't know who reported to at the jail? Do you remember saying that?
At the Durango jail, I did not know who to report it to, and there was no need for me to report it because there was no plan. However, had there been a plan, I would have found out who to report it to.
Bottom line is you told us that you didn't know who to report it to at the Durango jail, right?
I've never had to report it there.
I'm not asking you about that. Isn't it true whether or not you've had to report it? You came in just now and you started to tell us all the procedures involving how to report a suicide at the Maricopa County Jail, didn't you?
At the male jails, yes, because I've had experience with that.
And I'm not asking you about that because you weren't asked about the male jails in the follow-up, were you?
Yes.
You were asked about Miss Arias. Don't you remember her asking you that?
Yes.
She wasn't asking you about the male jails, was she?
But I used that as an example. I qualified my answer.
You didn't say that.
Okay, I thought I did.
Objection, Judge. This characterizes as his testimony.
Overruled, you may answer.
You didn't say that, did you?
I'd have to see the transcript.
So, with regard to this issue then, are you saying that you lack the knowledge to know at the Maricopa County Jail when it involves a female as to who you reported to? Is it yes or no?
I don't know the specific person. I know what procedures to follow, but I've never had to do it there. So I would have had to find out who is the proper person to report this to.
At the Durango Jail,
At
right?
the Durango Jail.
Actually, there's a problem with that because the defendant stays at the Estrella Jail, doesn't she?
Well, then it's the Estrella Jail.
Well, no, it's not just Isn't it true?
Sustained.
Isn't it true, sir, that the Maricopa County jail system only houses female inmates at the Estrella Jail?
Right, which is on Durango Street, so I'm sorry I got it confused.
Did I ask you where it was?
No, but I'm explaining my answer.
Right, no, you said that it was at the Durango Jail, right?
Excuse me, I meant the Estrella Jail on Durango.
There is also a Durango Jail, though, isn't there?
That's correct.
And so you knew that, right?
Well, of course I know that.
Beyond the scope.
Overruled.
And so now you know, when you were asked about it in terms of the suicide issue, you now know that, or you're now telling us, or told us before, that you would go to certain personnel at the Maricopa County Jail, yes or no, if the defendant had indicated true suicide, right?
Yes.
Now, sir, the other thing that you were asked about was about the books that you may or may not give to people, correct?
Correct.
At your office. Those books that you indicated are self-help books, right?
Correct.
By definition, self-help books involve treatment, correct?
No, they involve self-help.
And self-help is not to better the person?
Well, maybe to better the person, but they have to engage in the effort to help themselves. They don't have any external help from me if I'm not their therapist.
That's not, let's do it this way, it's not for the purpose of assessment, those self-help books, are they?
Not for the purpose of assessment, no.
And with regard to this issue about covering up and creating an alternative reality, the bottom line in this case, not the bottom line, covering up involves not telling the truth, correct?
Yes.
And creating an alternative reality, by your definition, also indicates not telling the truth, right?
Well, not telling the truth to me implies that the person has voluntary control over the story they're telling.
And I know that you want to say that, but
Objection. Argumentative.
Sustained.
yes or no, isn't it true that creating an alternative reality is talking about something that's not truthful? Yes or no?
Yes.
I don't have anything else.
All right, Dr. Samuels, you may step down. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to ask that you go back to the jury room for approximately 5 minutes, and the next witness will be in the courtroom to testify. Please remember the admonition.
Back to the jury.
Bring in the jury.
Please stand for the jury.
Please be seated. The record will show the presence of the jury, the defendant, and all counsel. The defense may call the next witness.
Judge, defense calls Ms. Alyce Laviolette.
Please come forward right up here to be sworn. Right up here.
Raise your right hand. You do solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Please walk right around here and have a seat.
Did you want some water? If you want to, you can pour some there.
Thank you.
Maybe the other cup, though.
What's that?
A clean cup.
Oh, a clean cup. All right. Never mind. Right.
All right, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Could you tell us your name, please?
My name is Alyce Laviolette.
And Ms. Laviolette, what do you do for a living?
I'm a psychotherapist. I do consulting and training, and I do expert witness occasionally.
Okay. And so, psychotherapy in what?
Psychotherapy, I have a private practice.
Okay.
And I have a specialty in domestic violence. I conduct 2 groups a week for men who perpetrate domestic violence, and I have a broad-based private practice where I do marriage counseling. I also do work with individuals. I work with adults. I work with battered women. I work with adult survivors of childhood abuse. And then I do a broad-based private practice with a variety of issues.
Okay. Let's talk about your education. So what I want to know is what qualifies you to do this type of work. So can we talk about your education for a second?
Yes, I went for 2 years here in Arizona at Glendale Community College. The first year at the campus that we used to call Reed Mullin Ford University, because it was right next to Reed Mullin Ford, and then the actual campus was sort of the campus that's there now was built for the second year. And I went to become a teacher. I got interested in psychology and then went over to Cal State Long Beach and did my bachelor's degree in clinical psychology. About 8 years later, I went back and did my master's degree in community clinical psychology, and then sat for the licensing exam. I had to do 3,000 clinical hours that were supervised, and then I sat for the licensing exam and became licensed in the state of California.
All right. So let's talk about your undergraduate degree first. So you said you finished up at Cal State North Beach?
Cal State Long Beach.
Long Beach.
Uh-huh.
I didn't go there. So, all right. So you finished up, is that where you get your bachelor's?
That's where I got my bachelor's.
And you were talking about becoming interested in psychology?
Yes.
Okay. And so what is your bachelor's in?
My bachelor's is in clinical psychology and my master's is in community clinical psychology.
Okay. What's the difference between a bachelor's and a master's degree?
About 2 years.
Okay.
I completed my master's in 2 years. It can sometimes take 3, but I actually did it in about 1.5 to 2 years.
All right. And your master's, you said, is in community clinical psychology?
Yes.
What does that mean?
Community clinical psychology is a program at Cal State Long Beach that was kind of unique. You were interviewed by faculty and students who had been through the program, and you had to pass, well, actually, they had to select from the applicants 12 people who would be part of this program. And back at the time, the reason I wanted to do this program was because it was hands-on. You actually got to go out in the field and work 20 hours a week doing field work, and that's what I wanted to do.
When you say field work, what does that mean?
You could pick a practicum, a place to work that had to be approved by your department. And so at that time, I did 10 hours in a community facility, a community like neighborhood kind of facility, where I was doing tutoring and registering voters and that sort of thing. And then I did 10 hours a week in the battered women's shelter, which I didn't really know anything about, and was wanting to work in some form of impacting violence against women, since I had known people who had been raped and sexually assaulted. And so I was going to work with sexual assault. And one of my friends was volunteering at the shelter and told me that it was a very interesting place to work. It was a very new field. So I decided that I would apply there, and I volunteered there 10 hours a week.
When you volunteer when you're working on your master's and in that particular community clinical psychology, and you're volunteering in it at a battered women's shelter, what is it that you're doing there?
Well, you're doing a lot of different things. I worked on the hotline. I was trained to work on the hotline. So I worked on the hotline.
And what's a hotline?
The hotline is a 24-hour crisis line where people can call anonymously, or they can give you their name, and they can tell you, they can talk to you about what's going on in their lives. And your job is to listen to them, sometimes make referrals, sometimes recommend that they come into the shelter, that sort of thing. And in addition to that, I did clerical kinds of work. I did fundraising for the shelter. I did what was called casual counseling with the women, which is you just sat with the women and the kids in the shelter and talked to them or ran a group. I did a self-defense class for them one time because I'd taken one self-defense class and I wasn't very good. But it was fun for the women to be up and moving around and doing physical things. So.
And can we talk timeline? When in the timeline of your life are we talking about? What year is this?
1978. 1978.
1978 is when you started with your master's?
1978 is when I started with my master's. 1980 is when I completed my master's. And I volunteered at the shelter until 1979, and then I was hired in 1979.
Okay. And when you were hired at the shelter in 1979, what were you hired to do?
I was hired to start a program for men who battered their wives. And the reason for that was that we did a little piece of research on women who had been in our shelter. The shelter opened in 1977. And we did a little piece of research to find out what happened to women after they had left the shelter, a year after they left the shelter. And of the women that we could find, over 80% had returned to the person who abused them within the first year after they left. And so our director was very farsighted, and she said, we need to start a program for the men who are in relationship to the women in our shelters so the women and children go back to a safer place. And actually, I didn't want to do that. Nobody actually at the shelter wanted to do that, but I needed a paid position. I had 2 children, and I needed a job.
Why did you ultimately take the job then? Well, let me ask you this. Why didn't you want to take the job of starting a men's group?
Because I'd worked with the women and the children, and it was really hard to see what had happened to them. And so I didn't initially want to do that, but I began to do it. I began to develop the program because I liked, program development. And then when I started the work, I really liked the work, and I stayed with it.
And when you talk about working at the shelter and starting to work on this men's group, are you also still going to school with your master's?
Yes, I'm still going to school with my master's.
All right. And to get your master's, are you taking classes as well?
I'm taking classes. I had a graduate seminar that met 3 hours a week and a supervision group that met 3, and then I had taken a lot of my classes prior to actually getting into the program. They could count classes I'd taken between my bachelor's degree and my master's degree.
Okay. And so at the time that you're now working at the shelter and you're working on starting this men's group, is there also something that you have to do to finish up your master's?
Yes, I had to do a thesis. After I completed my classwork, I did a thesis.
What does that mean? What does that mean?
You write basically a research paper, and it's a significant research paper on a topic that your clinical supervisor approves and that is something that would be of interest. And I did mine on perpetrators of domestic violence. And it was one of the early theses on that topic, because at that time I had sort of a corner on the market. I had there were only 2 programs in Los Angeles County that actually dealt with working with folks who perpetrated violence. And so I had clients who volunteered to participate in that study.
Okay, and when you talk about clients, are you talking about the men, the perpetrators?
Yes, the men who were in my group.
Okay, and that's the group that you created.
Yes.
What was the purpose of that group?
The purpose of that group was to teach people skills and maybe help them to work on issues that would enable them to be more effective parents, to be more effective partners in their relationships. And at the time, I hadn't had much counseling experience. And so I sort of based my group on a healthy family. What would a healthy family look like? And I talked to the women at the shelter because at that time I think there were 3 groups around the country that were doing this work. And I wrote to all of those groups and got information about what they were doing. And they were all doing work at about 6 to 12 weeks. They were doing short-term work. And I talked to the women in the shelter. And what was consistent from those women was that the men they were involved with had grown up in abusive families and needed help, that they needed to be, to have work on trauma issues. And so we created the group to deal also with some of those trauma issues.
And so this group that you created, that you worked with, was it just men who would be in this group?
Yes, in the state of California now, you have to have same-sex groups. At that time, you didn't, but we didn't have any referrals from women at that time.
Okay. And so how long did you keep working with this particular group? Well, you received your master's in 1980, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. When you receive your master's, let me back up a second. When you receive your master's, you said you have to write a thesis.
Yes.
Is that right? Do you have to do anything with that thesis?
You have to have it approved, and you have to sit for orals. So you sit with a group that questions you on your thesis and has to approve your thesis and feel that it's worthy of, if it's to be published. I don't believe mine was published. I think parts of it might have been used, but I never pursued publishing my thesis. I was just happy to get through with it, actually.
All right. So once you receive your master's, that was, you said, in 1980?
Yes.
Okay. And then are you still then at the shelter working in the men's group?
I'm still at the shelter, and I'm working with the men's group, but I'm also doing volunteer recruiting and training, and I'm doing all the community education for the group. So, for instance, I worked with the probation officers locally, and we set up the first 8-hour training program for probation officers on domestic violence in LA County, and then went around the state. And I worked with 2 probation officers on that. I did training for mental health. Initially, really, in 1979, the only people that kind of wanted training were church groups. And I went to United Methodist Women, I remember, were one of the first groups that supported the shelter. And I would go to speak to their church women's groups. I went to speak to the Seroptimist. I went to speak to the Rotary I went to speak to mental health agencies, so anybody actually who wanted to hear about it. And by the way, at conferences, we would have maybe 3 people in a workshop. People really didn't want to hear too much about it then.
Well, I was going to ask you, in the late 70s when this is occurring, was domestic violence something that was wide known?
No, it wasn't. There were very few shelters. Shelters began to open in the late 70s and early 80s in the United States.
And you said you were one of 3 groups in the U.S. who had a men's group? Is that right?
There were 3 other programs that were outside groups. There was one program in Washington State that was at a veterans hospital, and they had a residential program there that Ann Ganley did.
I'm sorry, that who?
Ann Ganley.
Okay. Is that somebody who's involved in domestic violence, battered women? Or?
Yes, she's involved with battered women, but also involved in doing programs for the men.
Okay. And so when you're doing how did you feel working with these men?
I guess that I felt I felt hesitant at first, but I quickly saw that they were in pain and that they, for some of them, really wanted to change. Some of them didn't. They just wanted to get their partners back. And so the men that I worked with who continued to stay in group because they had an option back then about staying in group really seemed to want to change. And I was excited about that. I thought that was terrific. And I wanted to be part of that process. And by the way, I worked with a male co-facilitator. We wanted to set it up to look like, as much a family as we could. And so I thought having a male-female team would be a good way to go with that. And having that power dynamic where you see respectful interaction between a man and a woman would be good role modeling in that group. So we did a lot of that. And I worked with him for 28 years until he retired.
Your
My co-facilitator, yeah.
Did any of these men you had started working with just the women in 1978, is that right?
Right.
Did any of these men ever frighten you when you started working with the perpetrators?
Objection, relevance.
Goes to her expertise, Judge.
Overall. Occasionally, I have been frightened probably 3 or 4 times in my career. If I was frightened very much, I wouldn't keep doing it because it would be too frightening. So there were several times where I really worried. One time with a guy that was a gangbanger who was someone who I know had murdered people.
And when you talk about the 3 or 4 times, how many men have you counseled throughout your career? Ballpark.
Well, probably a couple of thousand, but I'm not sure. There maybe less than that. I've done two groups a week for 34 years, and I've had normally not more than 12 people in a group, usually somewhere between 8 and 10 people in a group. And the groups change so that it's an open-ended group and people can come in at different times during the period of doing that group.
All right. So from going from the first men's group, what kind of therapy do you do now?
I do very broad-based therapy. I've worked with couples, high-conflict couples, people who need anger management. I work with adult survivors of childhood abuse. I continue to do that. I work with battered women. I continue to do that. I've worked with a few men who have been abused as well. I continue to do the groups. And I work with adolescents. And occasionally I'm working with parents on parenting issues.
And when you're doing this work, do you work always with groups, or do you sometimes work with just an individual?
I work with individuals. I work with couples. I work with, I haven't worked with large families, but I've worked with, like I'm working with a grandmother and her granddaughter now, and who has custody of her granddaughter and that kind of thing.
All right. So after you, how long did you stay working at the shelter with the men's group?
I worked at the shelter from 1978 till 1984.
Okay. And all that time from 79 to 84, was that where you were working with the men's group?
I worked with the men's group from 79 to 84, but I also worked with the women, and I also did community education, and I also recruited volunteers and trained them.
Okay, so you were doing a myriad of things.
Yes, I was.
All right. And in 1984, what did you move to?
In 1984, the funding collapsed for the shelter, and I needed a job, and I thought that it might be a really good idea to try to start my own business, which is something I'd never actually considered in my life before. And I had 2 children, and so I needed.
Sustained.
Oh,
Did you start your own? Did you start your own practice?
yes, I did. I started my own practice in 1984.
All right. And what kind of practice was that?
It was a psychotherapy practice, but I continued to do training. The probation department hired me for probably, I think I worked for the probation department on and off for about a decade, doing training for probation officers and people in camps for working with domestic violence.
So did you do volunteer work then along with your private practice?
Yes, I continue to do volunteer work.
All right. The volunteer work, did you actually work for the probation department, or was that volunteer work?
No, they paid me to do that.
Oh, okay.
They paid me to do training. I mean, I volunteered time, talking with the probation department, but when I trained their officers, that was actually a paid position.
Okay. And what did they pay you to do? You said train their officers. Train them to do what?
Train them to identify and work with people who were arrested for domestic violence.
Okay. And what about, and then with your volunteer work, did you do trainings with your volunteer work?
Yes, I continue to do training. I do training for shelters. I've done training for lots of people who requested it. I continue and have done training for churches. A number of churches have had issues where they've talked about domestic violence in their congregations, and they need to have some way to deal with that or to deal with anger, so I've done that. I do training. Most of the volunteer work I do now is training, although I'm on the alumni board at Cal State Long Beach, and so I do. I've reviewed grants for them and done a little bit. We're starting to meet with younger people and do some mentoring. I do that. I am a reviewer. I'm on the editorial board of a peer-reviewed journal, and I do peer reviews, and that's volunteer.
What peer review journal is that?
Journal of Child Custody.
Okay. Do you ever work in child custody issues?
I do. I consult usually with people when there are child custody issues. I have come in and done expert witness or consulting with child custody evaluators or with attorneys in domestic violence cases, and counseled battered women generally, and occasionally also I've worked with fathers who are going through domestic violence issues and working with them.
All right. And all this training that you do at churches and different areas, what kind of training is it? Is it all different kinds of training, or what are you training people to do?
It depends on the group. When I do training at churches, a lot of times it's to explain why battered women stay. It's to look at gender issues with domestic violence. Sometimes there are counselors out of the churches that want training on doing anger management. There are several groups, church groups, where they had a big enough congregation and they had people that wanted to be peer trained to do anger management groups. So I've done that. It really depends on the group and what they want.
Okay.
I've worked in almost every area of domestic violence. I did training on teen dating violence, and that was volunteer in the high schools. And I've spoken in the high schools in California, around in Long Beach and different areas, and done that as a volunteer. And that would be coming out and talking to kids about dating violence, teen dating violence, and what that looks like, and resources that they might have, and that kind of thing.
All right. And besides training, do you do speaking engagements?
Yes.
What kind of speaking engagements do you do?
I speak at conferences, I do keynote addresses, I've spoken for educational groups, I've keynoted for therapy groups, the California Association of Marriage Family Therapists, I keynoted for their conference. I've keynoted for, well, I keynote for the fatherhood, I've keynoted for, or done workshops at the Fatherhood Conference on a parenting curriculum that I helped develop.
What's a fatherhood conference?
The Fatherhood Conference is put on by Children's Institute International, and Herschel Swinger, who has passed away, was the founder of that conference. And it's really to encourage fathers to be the best fathers they can be, and for at-risk dads, fathers who've grown up in gangs or fathers who have, have not been the best fathers, to really improve their fathering. And there are a lot of men who are very interested in that and come to those conferences.
All right. And besides that speaking engagement, have you been asked to speak outside the United States?
Yes, I've spoken in a number of countries. I've spoken in Japan, Israel, New Zealand, Ireland, Canada, and then I've done some work for the State Department of the United States, and those are video conferences. I just did one in Kathmandu, Nepal. I didn't go to Kathmandu, but I did a video conference there, in Cape Verde in Africa, and in Tel Aviv.
And these speaking engagements, what is it that you're asked to speak about, generally speaking?
I'm asked to speak about setting up domestic violence legislation, community organizing around development of battered women's shelters and programs that are more holistic, that address the entire family. For the most part, that's it. They're countries where people are just developing things, although Israel is quite sophisticated. And when I go to these countries, I sometimes speak to the governmental groups on the creation of laws, because I have done some work on legislation as well.
On the what?
On legislation.
Oh, legislation. Okay. And you said you've done work with the Department of the State?
Yes.
And for the U.S. government?
Yes.
What is it that you do?
Those are the video conferences that I've done. I was asked to go to Sri Lanka and Maldives, and I was asked to go to Africa, but there was a very limited window of time, and I couldn't fit it into my schedule, and so I wasn't able to actually travel, so the video conferences were set up.
So when you're speaking to these other countries, is it the U.S. government that is asking you to speak to them?
Yes.
Is that what you mean?
Yes.
Okay.
Through the State Department and the embassies.
Okay. Okay. And how long has that been going on? Has that been going on through different presidencies?
During George Bush's presidency and Barack Obama's presidency.
All right. What about, you said you did some work with the LA County Probation Department. Have you done any further work with them? Just in terms of talking to probation officers about clients, but I haven't done training for them. I think, I'm trying to remember the last time I keynoted the State Probation Conference, and that's about the last time. I also did a speaking engagement for female probation officers that had a specialized group, and I did training for that group. A specialized group of what?
Just female probation officers.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Okay. Did you ever help to create any programs with the county department, the probation department?
Did I create programs?
Yeah, so like design any type of domestic violence training?
Well, yes, with in 1980 in California, we created a diversion law, and people were diverted from the system and sent to counseling. And so that was where I worked with the diversion officer and the supervisor of the adult probation department to develop the training for officers to be able to deal with this influx of new clients on this new issue.
All right. What about awards? Have you ever received any awards in the area of domestic violence or in that area?
Yes, I've received a number of awards. I've been very fortunate. I just received an award from the shelter that I worked at just this past year. It's called a Champion of Hope Award. I've received a Lifetime Achievement Award. I've received proclamations from the county and the state. And I've received from the Seroptimist and other groups awards.
Okay. And we've been mentioning California a lot. Is that where you currently live?
I live in California. I've
Okay.
lived in California since I moved there in '67.
All right. And were you originally from Arizona? You said you went to Glendale Community College to begin with?
I moved to Arizona when I was 10. I moved from New Jersey to Arizona. I went to Sunny Slope High School, and I come back from my high school reunions and still have friends back here.
All right. But other than that, your business and everything is in California?
My business is in California, yes.
Okay. And so when you're talking about helping to develop different probation trainings and things like that, that's why we're talking about Los Angeles County?
Yes, and the state of California.
The state
yes.
of California. Okay. Do you have any published works? Have you published anything in this area?
I have a book called It Could Happen to Anyone, Why Battered Women Stay. It's coming out in its 3rd edition in April. I have articles that I've written for the journal Child Custody, I have a chapter in a book called Domestic Violence Offenders. I have...
Let me ask you, the chapter in the book called Domestic Violence Offenders, what is it that you're writing about?
It's called A View from the Trenches, and it's about, it's sort of a 25-year retrospective. I can't remember. Well, it was 2002, I think it came out. And it was a retrospective on batters intervention programs and looking at what we currently know and what we knew and some of the things we look at to measure success in programs and some of the things we want to have happen in those programs.
Okay. And the book that you said that you wrote about why battered women stay?
Yes.
Is that what it's about?
Yeah, it's about why battered women stay.
All right. And when did you first write that? Do you remember?
The first edition was in 1993, and it became a bestseller for Sage Publications. And so they asked us to write a second edition, which we wrote in 2000. And then they asked us to write a third edition. And my co-author and I are old enough that we don't believe a fourth edition is going to happen.
All right. With regard to that particular book, how is it that you sit down to write a book like that? Is it based on research? What do you do to have that information available to you?
My co-author's a researcher. I was not a researcher. My co-author would bring me piles of research, basically, piles of articles, and I would have to read them and write them up in a way that could be understood. And we use case studies in the book. We made the book something that we hoped that folks could read who were victims and perpetrators of domestic violence as well, but also people who are just interested. It's used as a textbook currently in a number of universities back east. I was just a couple years ago speaking in Hawaii, and somebody from a small island near Sri Lanka came up to me and said that they used the book there. So I have no idea who else using it, but we feel pretty good about it because people have liked it. And we've also, we've had attorneys who have used it in their cases.
Okay. And clearly you're here testifying, so do you do forensic work as well?
Yes, I started doing forensic work in 1984. I was asked by an attorney to explain why a battered woman would kill and why she stayed. My first trial in 1984 was a domestic violence homicide trial. And at that time, the battered women's testimony was not considered. It really wasn't well thought of or well respected. And so I didn't testify in that case. I consulted in that case. But I know that I didn't even know that this was a job. I thought it was a volunteer position. And when she asked me to do it, I said, certainly I'd be happy to do it. And I said, I'm assuming it's a volunteer position. And she said, no, you get paid to do it. And so I was surprised.
All right. And since that time, do you know about how many cases you've worked on forensically?
I've worked on about 60 cases forensically. I don't do a lot of forensic work. I do usually about 2 cases sometimes 3 cases in a year, depending on whether I'm consulting.
Why don't you do a lot of forensic work?
Because it's very difficult for me sometimes to watch the process.
Objection, relevance.
Thank you.
Do you have your own practice as well?
My private practice?
Yes.
Yes, I do.
So besides coming here to testify, do you also have a private practice that you're running?
I hope so when I get back.
Okay. What types of cases, we're talking about the forensic cases that you've worked on. What types of cases have you worked on?
I've worked on homicide cases. I've worked on a stalking case, a kidnapping case. I've worked on child custody cases. Most of the cases I've done currently are child custody cases.
Let me stop you there. When you talk about child custody cases, is that a criminal case?
No, it's not.
Okay,
It's a family law case.
Okay,
So family law cases, I've done 2 civil cases, 1 federal case, 1 post-conviction case.
Okay. And of the criminal law cases that you've done, about who retains you? Do you have an idea who you work for more often, the defense or the prosecution?
I've worked for the defense about 16 times, 15 times, something like that. I've worked for the prosecution about 9 times. And I've done some prosecution work that I don't even think I have on my CV, where I've just consulted with the DA's office. I've done 3 consultations for the district attorney in Los Angeles County, and I've just volunteered. I've done that, and I do volunteer mock trial for the district attorney so they can practice with an expert witness. And I do that. I've done that twice now.
So you help the prosecutors in California get experience at cross-examining an expert like yourself?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And do you have a particular criteria that you use before you'll decide to accept a case?
Objection, relevance.
Approach.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to take the evening recess at this time. Please be back in the designated area at 10:30 tomorrow morning, 10:30. Please remember the admonition. Have a nice evening. You are excused.